What's up? All right, there we go, and we're live.
Hey everybody.
Hello.
Yeah, that was quick. Heretic was telling me not even 5 seconds before. He was like preparing to go live, and then we are live. So, I mean, there's no problem with that. I just wasn't wasn't expecting it.
A little abrupt, yeah. But, yeah, I think things worked out. So,
So, the topic of the stream today, we've been seeing this video getting shared around in the libertarian and Austrian communities that we frequent. Uh, it's a clip from the Michael Brooks stream. I don't know much about the Michael Brooks show. I'm not sure if it is streamed on YouTube or a different platform, and the channel is just clips from that podcast. I'm not I'm not intimately familiar with a lot of these like left tube or bread tube channels because a lot of people who watch our channel who share these clips around apparently are connoisseurs of cringe, but I personally have a very low tolerance for that kind of shit. But yeah, so this has been getting shared around Shane server, my server, Two Senses server. Basically, people really want to see this get trashed. So on the Michael Brooks show, there was a segment recently that featured Ben Burgess, who, if you don't know who that is, he runs a YouTube channel titled Ben Burgess, but he also runs one called Zero Books, which you've probably seen a video or two floating around from. His marketing ploy is that he's a Marxist intellectual, a professor of philosophy, and he puts out video essays and books which attempt to debunk right wingers with sick facts and logic. Although you can watch 5 minutes of pretty much any video of his to realize that that's a bit of false advertising. But yeah, so he's in the stream, and also he has Richard Wolff, who I'd imagine most people know who Richard Wolff is because Google tends to promote Richard Wolff quite frequently in my recommended feed, and I'd imagine other people have experienced the same issue where I am watching a Roderick Long lecture or something from the Mises Institute or the C4SS feed, and I fall asleep and wake up only to find Richard Wolff talking about how the capitalists stole his foreskin or something like that.
So
But okay, what were you gonna say? I'm sorry.
I'm just asking, like, the way you presented it sounds like Ben Burgess is trying way too hard to be the Ben Shapiro of Marxism.
He definitely is. In fact, one of the books he's written, because he's actually written books. I did a little bit of research on whether or not he actually was a professor, and found that he wrote a couple of books. On the cover of one of his books, he has he has a figure. The title of the book is "Logic for the Left." And on the cover of the book, he has like a caricature of Ben Shapiro about to say, "Facts don't care about your feelings," but he's cut off before he can finish saying feelings by, I think that's supposed to be David Hume, and then David Hume shushes him. Which, I mean, to be fair, David Hume probably is more of an intellectual than Ben Shapiro. If you treat Ben Shapiro as an intellectual in general, you're probably a bit out of your league. But yeah, you can sort of tell just by how they're framing their arguments some of the problems with their worldview. Anybody who's not a Marxist is some knuckle dragging right winger. What's a right winger? Anyone who's not a Marxist. What's a left winger? Basically, anybody who is a Marxist. Why is this political dichotomy right? Because fuck you, that's why.
And by the way, I got the cover of the book on the stream right now. Yeah, I'm pretty sure, yeah, that does look like David Hume to me.
Which, by the way, David Hume's views on ethics and the social sciences are absolute ass. But I definitely would consider him more of an intellectual than Ben Shapiro. I think we could at least agree on that.
Well, I don't think that's really controversial. I mean, has has Ben Shapiro contributed anything to the intellectual canon other than trying to regurgitate information that he only knows like ancillary information about?
He's contributed sound bites, heretic.
Oh, right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I forgot. It's like Aristotle's greatest contribution to philosophy is just a couple of sound bites. He's also got a couple YouTube channels where Aristotle epic debunks epic like just wrecks solipsists epic style. And there's like whole cringe compilations of Platonists trying to debunk Aristotle and Aristotle's students, and it's just embarrassing for them. They got like I think they're all the way up to 1,000 views on GreekTube.
All right, but
yeah, though.
Yeah.
In all honesty, like that. I'm just commenting on this cover one more time because I'm looking at it. Omen Rose said it does look like some weird ass shit post, and looking at it in that way, it looks like a very high effort, for lack of a better term, leftist meme. Because you know the stereotype about those memes where they're just unnecessarily wordy all the time.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, the fact that they are able to get their word count down to less than 100 shows that they clearly put a lot of thought and effort into this. This is probably the most thought and effort they put into anything they put out in the last 100 years.
But then there's also, I don't necessarily, I think that David Hume's views on politics were actually kind of edgy for, the kind of people who would be in Ben Burgess's audience. But I think my main issue with David Hume, I guess, is that he pushed the study of empiricism as a legitimate methodology, like in general, like normatively. Like it doesn't matter what type of science we're talking about. Like I would argue that in order to actually make a claim about an axiom, you need to be able to acknowledge a priori truth, because the idea that sensory observations are both objective and that sensory observations themselves can somehow reveal things. Not only is that idea Platonist and contradicted by observable reality, but it's also self-contradictory even as a principle. You can only make observations with sense in the sensory realm. Well, that's an a priori claim of truth. So it doesn't even survive past its premise. You know that you're dealing with a solid foundation for your methodology when it fails in its premise.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think you can probably give Hume the benefit of the doubt in this regard, and that is, in his time period, everyone was a Platonist.
Well,
So,
also because David Hume wrote specifically that he would actually, in one of his essays, he wrote that he would love to see a priori truth proven correct. I don't know how much of that was just a confidence trick or his genuine thoughts. I don't see exactly, other than just him being a state-sponsored academic, what is issue with accepting a priori truth to be the basis of pretty much any observation. I don't see how that would be difficult or a conflict of interest. In fact, there are a couple of studies which attempt to frame themselves as proof of a priori truth, but attempt to divert that towards politically safe conclusions, like Kantianism, for instance. But yeah, enough about David Hume. Have you also showed this this awesome remake of the Gadsden flag made by one of our fans in the Backalley Discord the other day?
Give me a second here. Let me just pull it up so people can take a look at it. And I don't remember what I called the file. Yeah, there we go. Alright, people can see it now.
I love everything
Holy crap,
about
this thing is huge.
Oh, all right. But yeah.
Anyways, continue.
So I remarked basically because somebody posted that like red flag with the secretary bird, because that's the bird in question that's outlined there. With the secretary bird in black in front of a red background that says "Fight Back," and I thought, you know what, that actually would make a decent logo for libertarianism if we were to change this up a little bit. And then somebody responded by, putting. Well, they changed the design of the secretary bird to be more forward-leaning, which I think implies striking a bit more than the original did. But in front of an agorist color scheme, and changed the text at the bottom to "I will not be poisoned, and I love everything about it now."
Mm-hmm.
Because specifically because like you've probably seen like a lack of Gadsden imagery on the channel, and I understand where like libertarians using the logo are coming from, but I've always personally been a bit like skeptical of the logo because it's based on the Join or Die comic from the late 1800s in the colonies that was supposed to advertise basically for the American Revolutionary Movement. And so basically, it's a symbol of political liberalism, pro political liberalism, and liberalism. It runs into conflict with libertarianism in a couple of different ways. That being one of them, but also because it sponsors the existence of a political economy. It also suggests that the state is the sort of the reason that you have rights. So if you're defending your rights, then you're defending the state. And I think philosophically that runs into libertarianism. In fact, that puts it at odds with libertarianism. But also, I would find it weird that libertarians would use a logo that basically, even if you're looking at it, it sort of suggests that like what we have right now is basically an approximation of a free ethical society. Whereas libertarianism is something actually quite radical, and what we have right now is basically everything that libertarians would stand against. So I think that I like the idea of this being sort of the agorist logo, but it works in two grounds. It works basically as a stance against the state, a more accurate characterization of what the state is. It's an organization, so I think it better characterizes the libertarians' opposition to the state, in the sense that we already have rights, but the state's existence, the monopoly and arbitration, and the state establishing this political infrastructure by creating artificial scarcity and sponsoring all these partners that it has in legal enterprise. I think that I think it would be a better characterization of the libertarian, and to subvert the ability for that to exist. And that's what this sort of suggests.
Mm-hmm.
But also, it works on another level of, there are a lot of influences in the libertarian movement trying to basically co-opt its talking points and and to dilute its principles. So the "I will not be poisoned" suggests also that this flag represents striking back against co-optation and an active skepticism towards co-optation. So I love everything about it. And for those who don't know, a secretary bird is it's a flightless bird of prey, which basically it basically kills. Well, it preys on snakes. I don't think it strictly preys on snakes, but it kills things by basically like curbing them to death. It has
Curb
and
stomping.
yeah, and snakes particularly are defenseless against it because it has long legs. So if they strike, they're not going. If the snakes try to strike back, they're not really going to hit the body of the bird because the bird's able to keep itself above the snake enough to where it can't really do anything about it.
Mm-hmm.
And that also, I guess, in an abstract sense, could be seen as laudable for libertarianism as a goal that's inevitable, and the snake representing political authority and political subversion tactics against libertarianism. Not
Well,
really anything they can do about it.
well, the thing that I'm thinking about is that the way that the snake, or what the snake implies, is that the snake is very passive. Well, not necessarily passive, they do their own thing, but generally they're completely harmless as long as they're left alone. But as I suggested earlier, it does imply a kind of passivity, that a danger that only is threatening if you're, annoying. I mean, if you're annoying them. Whereas this secretary bird, or as will probably be known later as the agorist bird, it's significantly more active. It's a bird of prey, and is something that is fundamentally antithetical to the more passive nature suggested by the libertarian snake, or as it's being co-opted now. You're probably going to. I mean, you've seen the alt-right and a lot of other quasi-Marxist groups, including outright Marxists, started to use it. I
Yeah.
mean, and so, yeah, you have this thing that's significantly more active, that's more representative of the kind of direct action that agorism necessarily directly calls for. I was going to say suggests, but it's not a suggestion at all. If you're an agorist, you're directly engaged in direct action that subverts the organizations and the organizational monopolies that the state white market creates to co-opt the economies that exist in society.
Yeah. So the Gadsden flag would represent those people who their response to police brutality on YouTube is just to record them and scream, "Why are you doing this? You can't do this. It's against my rights." Whereas the agorist symbolism, I think this more aptly represents the agorist position, where we're basically going to be passive until we can network with enough people more consistently that if the cop shows up and tries to violate somebody else's rights, so they can send out a distress signal or through some means and have 20 or 30 people show up with bats and guns and chase that motherfucker out of town.
Mm-hmm. And I remember seeing a whole lot of stuff going down, like as soon as like the Ferguson riots started to, not Ferguson, sorry, the George Floyd riots started going out, that there was a mass resigning of police officers in multiple precincts across the country. One video, I think it was in Detroit, but I could be misremembering, of a police officer with his window rolled down, pulling up to a traffic light, and he's stopped by a traffic light. It's a red light. Guy's filming. Like, there's no arrest or anything going on. This is just a guy on the street having an idle conversation with a cop, and he just was like, "Hey, what's up, officer?" And he goes like, "Well, I'm resigning. You win." And the guy with the camera's like, "What?" And he's like, "Yeah, there's no reason, like, being a police officer just it sucks now. There's nobody really wants to do it anymore." And so I was planning on retiring in a couple years, but yeah, I mean, like, I've got people to take care of, I got families to feed. So yeah, you win. And of course, I'm
People aren't
paraphrasing
afraid of
what was actually said in the video. And I remember, I think it was actually on Bucker Barlson, his show, which I watched because it happened to be on when I was around. Uh, he didn't show that clip specifically, but he was lamenting about all of the budget cuts that a lot of police districts across the country are facing, and how it's absolutely horrible that this is happening. And my thinking is just like, you know what? Well, another thing he said is that it's become very uncomfortable for police officers to, do their job. And my only
good.
thinking is, good. I want them to be uncomfortable in doing their jobs. I want them to question whether or not they're going to see their family at the end of the day when they put on that magic uniform and their magic little piece of metal that tells them that they have special rights that the rest of us don't. I don't
Yeah,
want
it's
them.
good
I want them
that
to
people.
reconsider ever pulling someone over, and I want them to look upon their arrest quotas with apprehension, with fear, if they have to. I want them to be terrified. I want them to be doing literally anything else other than being government agents.
It honestly doesn't matter why, just as long as people recognize the cops as a threat to their ability to function in society and a threat to them just in general. That's sort of the idea. That's the ideal goal we should be moving towards. But anyway, we've been going on about this way longer than I initially thought we would have been when talking about this pre-stream. So I don't know if this was just delaying the inevitable on your part, which I don't blame you because Richard Wolff is a fucking idiot. Not to spoil anything because I did watch the video for the stream, and
I made a
yeah, this
video.
guy is supposed to be. This guy is supposed to be. He's supposed to have a PhD in. I'm not entirely. Is it economics or philosophy? Either fucking way, these are the sort of arguments I would expect from like a blue check mark on Twitter.
Let me
This is
check.
embarrassing.
He's professor emeritus of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I don't remember what emeritus means. And his PhD, give me a second here, in economics, which he got in 1969.
What, a liberal arts college? uh,
Apparently.
I bring that up because I want you guys to keep that in mind for those who aren't too familiar with Richard Wolff before watching the stream. Can't imagine that many of you are because Google seems to basically consider him their Marxist of choice. But yeah, this guy, I've watched some stuff of his outside of the stream that we're talking about, and like this is a guy who lacks knowledge that, like, regardless of your perspective on studying markets, you should know if you have a PhD in the field, which means you've been studying for over a decade. For instance, somebody who's been studying for over a decade should know the difference between a wage and a salary, and that's something that on multiple occasions I've seen Richard Wolff demonstrate he doesn't understand.
It occurs to me that, and I kind of got this perspective back when I did a response to him in, I think, in late 2017. It's been a while since I talked about him, so yeah, this is why I was talking to you earlier before the stream started about how it's been a long time. Wasn't referring to anything we did together, but it was just something I did, like probably like 3 or 4 years ago. But yeah, this guy is he's a piece of work, and at least from my understanding, he does not have a very well-rounded understanding of the topics he attempts to profess to have extensive knowledge of. It's like all he does is consume ideas from other Marxoids, which, to be fair, there is enough of them in academia that they can't just circle jerk each other. But what you have is an incredibly narrow and very repetitive intellectual dynamic where all they're really doing is just talking to each other, and they don't actually talk about anything or talk to any opponents of theirs that actually exist. Well, I mean, the only thing that they can actually reply to is Hoppians directly, but that's only because Hoppians are just inverse Marxists.
Yeah, Hoppians are basically the straw man capitalist that Marxists have built of their political opponents, except in actual ideology.
Mm-hmm. I swear that's what happened. Hop had Marxist professors, Marxist mentors, and he saw the straw man of capitalism they were building and just thought to himself, hey, you know what? This actually doesn't sound that bad. And build his entire philosophy presuppositionally around that. But enough about that. That's probably saving for another time. But yeah, Richard Wolff is just kind of indicative of what happens when you try to, keep yourself into an intellectual bubble. You end up not really being able to understand where other people are coming from, and as such, your ability to actually discuss the issues is hilariously narrow. All you can really do is just state your conclusions, and then just hope that if you state your conclusions enough times repetitively, the other person will just go, yeah, you know what, you're right. But suffice to say that that's not going to happen. Sorry.
You're done. You paused, but anyway, I was just going to say, before we start, I wanted to sort of comment on the title of the video as well. Richard Wolff and Ben Burgess debunk von Mises. Really, everything that he's ever done, his theory of capital, the business cycle, I would be skeptical, honestly, if either of these boobs even understand the Austrian business cycle theory. His contributions to monetary theory, explaining why methodological dualism is the only really viable way to approach economic theory, or at least that being his contribution. All of that is not only disputed here, but debunked, which, by the way, I can't really stand it when people title videos with things like debunk, especially when it's like a person, or like the subject is a person or a particular argument that they've made. Seems like that's something that you should sort of demonstrate with the video, but it's very clear just based on the title. They identify Mises as just a representation of a series of views that they don't really understand. They just know that, or the states told them that it's supposed to be associated with these particular branches of thought, regardless of whether or not that even makes sense, or whether or not Mises actually, was a proponent of those types of thoughts, or a skeptic. And that's what, when you're debunking von Mises, you're debunking basically a representation of all of those views, because politics causes people to equate positions in philosophy or their understanding of what their interests are with policy proposals, which is particularly hilarious in the case of Mises, because if either of these people had ever read anything by any Austrian economist, or even so much as understood what the sort of fundamental premise of the Austrian methodology is, they would understand that the fundamental criticism of the Austrians is not of state planning, but just political planning in general, or the idea of things like administrative prices, or the idea that you can define economies and how people associate for them, rather than observing these things as emergent properties in society and then trying to demonstrate trends or explain why they happen based on these principles.
I can guarantee you that if Richard Wolff's understanding of the things he's criticizing is as secondhand as I believe it is, he hasn't read a single thing by Mises. He's just read other Marxist critiques of it and then formulated his opinions around that. He's basically probably the Mr. Dapperton of Marxism.
That tends to be. I've spoken of the phenomenon of philosophical inbreeding previously, which is basically where schools of thought discourage, or major figures in a school of thought discourage research of the subjects which are being criticized, or arguments for those positions. And as a result, their followers and people who are inspired by them, maybe even based on, their own faulty understandings of the principles being put forward by the areas of research that are being criticized, tends to be based on a faulty understanding of what the ire of their criticism is actually proposing. So what you get is, I call it philosophical inbreeding, because you get a school of thought which is disconnected from reality and basically chokes on itself to liken it to the actual genetic side effect of inbreeding. They become malformed and they choke on themselves because they're not actually arguing against what the other side put forward. They're arguing against essentially a straw man built upon straw man arguments, built upon misrepresentations or misunderstandings.
And I like what people are saying in the comments about Richard Wolff having a PhD. PhD or PhDom. A PhD in I am rightness, and a person with PhD equals government egghead.
Pretty much. And that's especially like something that, that's the reason Hayek was critical of economics as a profession in academia, or just professions in academia in general, because academia is basically just a one giant licensing scheme as it exists in modernity, and the things that you go to academia to get degrees for are basically just they're basically government licenses. So you have to have one of these things in order to be a worker in that particular field in the legal political infrastructure created by the state. Doesn't matter if you actually know what the fuck you're talking about. That just, the fact you have the state paper means that you are more qualified than anybody else. And yeah, you get things like this where people like Richard Wolff are taken seriously because they spent 12 to 14 years of their lives writing down what some government-paid crony told them to write down. That's sort of the conflict of interest, and the other major problem with academia as an institution is that it creates conflicts of interest, and a lot of the fields of study which are prominent in academia are not prominent based on the merit of their arguments, or based on whether or not they're actually more valid. It's either just however many people, it's a lot of people agree that they're valid, or they have an interest in promoting those types of studies because of their position in state academia. It's the reason that you see Keynesianism and Marxism so prominent in the economic studies, even though macroeconomic models and positivist models in general have been so roundly refuted that even the mainstream, the sort of mainstream economists like the monetarists, basically have to pretend that they're proponents of these things while introducing things like indifference curves or these sort of this basically monetary theory that implies charterism. To sort of wean it in back to politically safe conclusions while pretending that it's the observations made by the Austrians. Anyway, should we start the stream or should we start watching the stream, I guess?
Yeah, let's go ahead. This is 15 minutes, which, I mean, it kind of showcases exactly what I was talking about earlier in regards to understanding of von Mises, because if you have a thorough understanding and a thorough debunking of von Mises, usually you could go on for a lot more than 15 minutes. I mean, just think about all the times you and I have been in the Discord voice chat and how long we can just go on and on and on about Hop. To say nothing about the Hop essay specifically, which is, I think, over 2 hours long.
Yeah. Not again. This is about as close as I'm going to get to a spoiler. But the reason why they're able to keep this down to 15 minutes is because they refer to anti-concepts quite frequently, like the right, the left, capitalism, socialism. And it's very obvious, even within the context of what they're talking about, that socialism in particular is referencing multiple different ideas.
And do they bring up the term neoliberalism?
Not that I recall, but they might. I also didn't make it through the entire video.
Alright, well, let's get started. We've delayed the inevitable long enough.
Alright.
Joining us now for the debunk is Ben Burgess. He's author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left, available now everywhere you can find books. Professor Burgess, how are you?
I'm very good.
Thanks for returning. So you have given us a video, and I guess the debunk that you and Professor Wolff are going to do tonight is the calculation argument against socialism. Now, can you set up what is this video you sent? Like,
basically, just like this is how you know that the Marxist types don't actually know what the calculation argument is, because as I mentioned earlier, they say specifically it's the argument against socialism, but in reality, Mises himself pointed out that it applies to any model of organization in general, and both Hayek and Lockman went on to expand upon this in much greater detail. Where we look at these politically connected businesses like Walmart, and we could see effects of them being diseconomies of scale, but being protected from going under and having to scale down because of state subsidies and because of legal privileges created by the state.
If you want, sorry.
But yeah, this doesn't just apply to the state, though incidentally, every state program, because fundamentally state programs are attempts to sort of dichotomize different regions as districts for trade, and try to prescribe things like interest rates and administrative prices through their various cartels and state policies. They attempt to basically create economies from the top down, which people are allowed to associate within without being harassed by them. The Austrians, though, are fundamentally critical. Sorry, I digress a bit. The state finds itself in the Austrians' crosshairs at pretty much every turn, specifically because that's what the state does. It tries to prescribe. It tries to prescribe market incentives, and it creates artificial scarcity while privileging certain market actors at the expense of others, and that causes fundamentally a dislocation effect. But we'll go on about that a little later. But basically, if Marxists really understood what the argument was, what they would understand is that it's a criticism fundamentally of any instance where an economy or a market is having incentives or is having like price rates being set by some sort of cartel or central planner. So Marxists would probably, if they actually understood the implications of it and didn't just see capitalism bad or property bad, what they would understand is that this is actually not only a more radical criticism of the political economy as it exists in modern society. What they would also see it as essentially a better explanation for a lot of the things that they criticize, like subsidies, for instance, or what they refer to as the wealth gap. Well, this is a better. The Austrians provide a better, more nuanced understanding of what resources and wealth are, whereas they're still stuck talking about it in Malthusian terms.
Mm-hmm. And I think you can demonstrate pretty clearly Marxoid's lack of understanding of the economic calculation problem. Ask them, do you understand the economic calculation problem? Yes, I do. I understand everything about it, and I understand that it does not make any sense whatsoever. Okay, so Walmart is able to efficiently allocate resources across its entire organization? No, of course not. Don't be ridiculous. But you said that the the economic calculation problem is not correct. Yes, the economic calculation problem has no explanatory power whatsoever. And I don't think you can get them to square that circle because Marxists are extremely well practiced in doublethink. But I think it should demonstrate exactly what I'm talking about, and everything you said is absolutely correct. If they really understood it, they would even make very rudimentary attempts to reconcile it with a lot of their other ideas. For example, labor theory of value, how large monolithic organizations would not be able to efficiently allocate or are unable to efficiently allocate the cost of goods and services in terms of their labor, and thus it will be better to have everything done more locally and done in a lot more communal, mutual aid societies. Kind of the same, kind of something that Marxoids usually talk about in terms of how they imagine society ought to be organized in the first place. A lot more local, a lot more community-based, and just generally some vaguely decentralized ideas that they'll occasionally pay lip service to, but no, it seems like that they are so hung up on this that they're all but demanding that we submit to a single monolithic hegemonic organization that is just going to impose Marxism upon the entirety of society.
Yeah, Marxist, and that's sort of where we get into problems with everyone who's not a Marxist is a capitalist, and everybody who is a capitalist basically has the same ideas. Because Austrians, regardless of their political views, basically see the way that the state sort of divides up land claims through legal fiat and then defends land claims that can't be defended naturally. They see organizations like Walmart and central banks and just the idea of a proprietary finance market itself. By proprietary, I mean defended by the state, and which attempts to engineer things like administrative prices and interest rates for every community in the world, essentially. Austrians see those things fundamentally in a troubling light. The libertarian side of the Austrians see them basically as parasites, which couldn't exist in a free society, and fundamentally are one of the reasons that the state continues to exist now. And from the economic perspective, they create distortions because people don't actually know don't have a good idea of what resources exist, because you have the supply and demand for all these markets being basically decided by cartels and state agencies.
Mm-hmm. Now, someone in the chat is asking me what I think about the Great Reset, and I'm just going to read off of what I said on the Discord when someone else asked me the same question. For those of you who don't know, the Great Reset is supposed to be this plan that a lot of governments across the world have to try to get themselves out of their crazy debt cycles and rapid inflationary cycles that they're currently trapped inside, by essentially resetting their debt. However, even if it's going to be as they say, there are several problems that I can identify right off the bat, and that is that, well, I have 5 points that I wrote down. 1, the state is already at its limit in terms of its ability to finance itself. A Great Reset, even if they could do things like eliminate all government debt and set it all to zero, will not permit the state to persist, as its inability to finance itself will not be fixed one iota by this reset. 2, attempts to finance itself being the state, will result in hyperinflation, something the Great Reset is incapable of resolving or addressing. 3, increased totalitarian control of society, which is of course necessary for a government that is trying to finance itself with the level of spending that it needs just to be able to continue to enforce its will as much as it can. It will only drive more people into counter economies, which further drives the state into the death spiral that the Great Reset is devised to try to dig themselves out of. 4, many aspects of state monopolies are already in smoldering ruins. Finance is now able to be decentralized through cryptocurrency. The gun control debate is over thanks to 3D printed guns, and complying with copyright legislation nowadays is literally a choice. 5, the state is over-leveraged on highly centralized command and control structures subject to attack from bored assholes in their parents' basements. In theory, one man can anonymously cripple the entire US military in one afternoon with a few button presses. That's pretty much what I said. That's the and Sayabonga Doob is asking, what is the economic calculation problem? Do you want to address that one?
So the economic calculation problem is something which was, I think maybe Bob the Work sort of touched upon it prior to Mises. I know that there was an economist who was still sort of clinging on to the French liberal school after the Austrian school was already sort of a thing, which, for those who don't know, the French liberal school was basically the precursor to the Austrians before the marginal revolution in the 1870s. But that guy's name was Yevis Guyot. I forgot that I almost didn't even mention his name. But he wrote a book 10 years before Mises called Socialistic Fallacies, where he essentially observes the same thing Mises did. But Mises was the more popular proponent of the argument. Basically, it's that because organizations which attempt to prescribe market signals because organizations which attempt to prescribe market signals operate fundamentally in a disconnected manner from those market signals. They don't have they don't have an accurate idea of the resources that actually exist in whatever economy or market we're attempting to observe. This causes people to invest and produce, so the supply and demand around a false idea of what supply and demand actually exists for the economy in question, which leads either to resources being misallocated, so overproduction of certain things that nobody really cares about or nobody actually wants, or it leads to areas being deprived of resources because there is actually a large amount of demand in that area and it's going unmet because all of the market signals indicate that supply should be directed elsewhere. And this is an unsustainable model because it inevitably, particularly for finance, it leads to interest rates having to be lowered increasingly just because they're at this point throwing glitter spaghetti at the wall and just trying to hope that some people in the legal market are having their most highly valued preferences met, as opposed to those people actually going out and being able to do so for themselves. But eventually you get to the point where there's no way mathematically for there to ever be enough resources to match the market signals, because the market signals have been created around the impression for so long that these debts represent assets that will eventually be paid off, and that there just are resources that can pay off those debts. The system, in a proprietary sense, proprietary systems inevitably, from an economic standpoint, collapse in on themselves because there simply are not enough resources to meet the demand that exists according to the rates that they've set. That's, in a nutshell, the economic calculation problem. And, given that I basically spent 5 minutes trying to explain that to an extent which would make it understandable from an outside perspective, you could imagine that it's laughable that these people think that they've refuted Mises's entire every contribution he's ever made in his entire methodology in 15 minutes on a live stream.
I love my personal favorite summation of the economic calculation problem was made by Jacob Spinney, and that is simply to state that you cannot exchange with yourself. That's the gist of the economic calculation problem.
Well, I guess that's an explanation of it as well, but doesn't really explain why, from a standpoint of, having all of these actors actually exchanging resources.
I know, but that's the TLDR version. But there is one other thing I wanted to say about the Great Reset that I didn't get into before that I just thought of a few seconds ago. And that is that the Great Reset, even ignoring all 5 of those points I brought up, there is still a very significant problem that I don't think that state actors and the banks are even willing to address. And that is the fact that there's no clear definition on what the Great Reset is going to entail. And I can guarantee you that although they're talking about it quite a bit, and they're doing all sorts of secretive meetings in the United Nations, the European Union, NATO, and all these other big multinational organizations, that each individual actor, not just in different states, but in different politicians within those states, are all going to have different mutually exclusive ideas for what the Great Reset is going to entail. I mean, we've been talking about late stage statism quite a bit outside of streams, and I've been observing that the competition between individual state actors has started to become significantly more ruthless, or at least that's what it appears to be. And my observation is that they all sense the inevitable collapse of their power, their ability to get power, and for that reason, they're starting to become, well, I said it already, increasingly ruthless. So with this in mind, they're going to do whatever it takes to try to grab their share of power or take it away from someone else by whatever means necessary. What this entails... Sorry, I wasn't quite finished. What this entails is that they're going to try to seize power. They're going to try to win elections a lot more, ruthlessly. And they're going to do whatever it takes. We're basically at the point where we're at the end of the Roman Empire, and there's a civil war every other week. They still agree on the basic premises of statism. The tax and spend, the welfare warfare state is still going to continue no matter who's in power, but now they're fighting over the scraps. They're trying to decide who it is that gets to enrich themselves and their families at the expense of everyone else. And as I'm sure you're aware, there can't be two presidents of the United States. And so that's what a large part of this, conflict is all about. And knowing this, we can then infer that given this Great Reset idea and its attempt to try to keep the lights on for another 5 minutes, that a lot of state agents, sensing their imminent demise, are going to attempt to co-opt the Great Reset towards enriching themselves in some manner. And with this in mind, we can imagine that given the potentially hundreds of individual heads of state that are all looking to get a slice of the pie, in addition to the bankers, in addition to other politicians from these governments, that you're going to have a very significant disagreement that I don't think that they're even equipped to reconcile, let alone in the time frame of the state's current lifespan, which I would argue is a lifespan measured in days.
Yeah, and another thing that I've noticed on that note is that the state's political partners in industry, so firms that receive significant leverage because they are licensed or they are more influential in the political economy in that particular market than like the small mom and pop shops like McDonald's, for instance, or Walmart or EA. I've noticed that these organizations, which because the more that they scale up and the more legal, the more they entrench themselves in the white market, the more they have to associate with the banks, and the more that the banks have leverage over them. And I've noticed that increasingly, especially over the last couple of years, that these organizations have become, not only less competitive in an economic sense, as in they're less receptive to what consumers actually care about or what people are complaining about, but they seem to be operating around spend-heavy models specifically. I'm sure everybody can see this in the gaming market. I watched a lecture recently, which I wish I could remember the name of it off the top of my head. But if anybody wants to join the Backalley server after the stream, I'll go ahead and link that lecture in the resources channel. Basically, a lot of these like bigger politically connected studios like EA or 2K or Activision, like they're specifically telling the dev studios that they contract to make games less fun and more grindy as a way to incentivize spending, because more of their assets are owned by shareholders because they're more closely connected to the banking system. So basically, in order to continue sustaining themselves at that point equals continuing to produce bigger and bigger returns within an increasingly limited number of actual resources available in the market. And this results in some of the problems we've been seeing people bitching about, which are unfortunately attributed to market incentives, absent any sort of state intervention. Oh God! Are you showing that on stream?
I am not going to show that on stream, unfortunately.
Okay. Heretic just posted a meme in our Discord DMs, and he doesn't want to show that on stream.
I actually don't know if it's safe to show on stream.
Probably shouldn't.
Yeah, but yeah, I can see a lot of people in the chat are antsy to get us to start getting back on the video. They say that we're not even going to get to the intro ever, which we already did, so it's a non-issue.
Yeah, this stream we're gonna go on until we finish this video, and not to spoil it, but afterwards I'm gonna basically clip our response and upload it to the main channel. So,
all right. Anyways, continuing.
Who put it together?
I think that it's one of those, Hayek Institutes, von Mises Institute, one of those kinds of organizations.
Just a quick question: is there a Hayek Institute?
not to my knowledge.
Let me look that up real quick. Hayek Institute. I think there is, but it's like some. It is like a literal Austrian think tank.
Okay.
There's not really much. I think pretty sure that this guy's just displaying his own ignorance because I mean, unless he knows Austrian, because I don't think this is a thing that he would be familiar with. But yeah, I'm pretty sure he was just throwing names off the top of his head because he really didn't know what he was talking about.
Those are the only two Austrian economists he could name.
Most likely, yeah. Anyways,
all right.
Continuing.
I'm not 100% sure about this particular video, but I think this is something that comes out of one of the many institutes or organizations that libertarian rich people give to propagate the work of their classic theorists.
Okay, so all right, so that's so this is coming from the Mises Institute. I'm actually
some classic projection from the Marxist intellectual who was probably born with a silver spoon in his mouth. I know that Richard Wolff was, because he very clearly has never actually worked outside of academia a day in his life. But I don't know so much about Ben Burgess. Perhaps I'm making unfair assumptions, but I do know that he is right now actively teaching as a professor in philosophy. But,
people are paying tens of thousands of dollars to be indoctrinated by that fool.
Yeah. So neither Mises or Hayek, the people that he mentioned, are actually libertarians. They're just economic theorists. Mises was a utilitarian, and Hayek was a social democrat. So basically, they would disagree with libertarianism in quite a few regards. So that's one area in which their ignorance is already shining through, where they don't understand the difference between views on politics, social theory, and economic theory as being distinct. They see them as basically being the same thing, and any position in those particular fields of interest are just supporting these sort of policy prescriptions imposed by the state. And they all obviously must support the state doing certain things because political science is unquestionable.
Most likely. Anyways, I'm just going to back up a bit because I feel like our interruption is kind of like disrupting some of the context of what they'll be saying.
Sure.
Yeah.
Classic theorist.
Okay, so all right, so this is coming from the Mises Institute. I'm actually very civil libertarian, but in my communist dystopia, if you were watching this, you'd automatically be put on some sort of list. And let's play.
Civil libertarian, and he's already threatening to put people on lists for
Well, he disagrees with in concentration camps. That's unless his idea of libertarianism is like Hoppe, I don't know what the fuck he's talking about.
He's probably using the very Marxist idea of libertarian, which is basically I would go so far as to say he has a very Mussolini idea of liberation, libertarianism, and freedom.
Yes, the state will manage everything, and then the state will wither away through some unexplained means.
No. That's not the Mussolini idea. That's the Marx idea. The Mussolini idea of libertarianism and just liberty in general is the freedom of the state to do whatever it wants. So if you're a fan of Mussolini's ideas and you call yourself a libertarian, you're only a libertarian in the sense that you want the state to have as much liberty to do whatever the hell it wants as possible. So in that respect, yeah, I think there's a good case to be made that this, I forget his name, Michael something.
Michael Brooks.
Michael Brooks, thank you. That he's probably a civil libertarian in the Mussolini sense.
Yeah, that is the impression that I get from talking to libertarians who basically consider themselves a libertarian because they have Marx's view of the material dialectic, or they argue from that position, and it ends with there not being a state. Libertarians argue there shouldn't be a state, therefore I'm a libertarian. Yeah, I get that impression from these people that is very much the way that they think about liberty. It's not really getting rid of these institutions that make it so people that make it so people can't defend their rights and put people into positions of privilege where they can do things that other people can't at the expense of other people. No, that's not what Marxists want at all. They want to essentially install the ultimate version of such a type of such an organization, but they promise it'll be benevolent, even though everything about such an organization's existence informs us that what it's incentivized to do and the interests of the people running that organization, as well as the leverage such an organization would have over people in society, indicates that such an organization is not going to do that.
Mm-hmm. And just to clarify, because I know that this is going to get brought up sooner or later, I'm not calling Brooks a fascist. I'm simply saying that his understanding of libertarianism, to me, sounds like it is inspired from fascism. But anyways,
it honestly doesn't matter because all statism sort of starts from the same relativistic approach that fascists base their philosophy on, and in practice, all states are functionally the same in terms of sort of ultimate. They're the ones that have a monopoly in arbitration, and they defend any claim that they deem to be in their interests. I guess the only reason to even make a distinction between states is in terms of like how they model their political economies and how likely such a model would be to sustain itself in the particular environment that they operate within. But in terms of ethics or how they interact with society, the state is basically the same, regardless of what model they're running. So, yeah, I would say that Marxists are fascists. I would also say that pretty much anyone. There's not even really a reason to make a distinction between Marxist and fascist. You're a statist, therefore you're an authoritarian, and what you argue for is authoritarian ends.
Mm-hmm. Oh, but Esso, you're just labeling all statists to be the same.
Yes.
Well, you
the
see,
yes face meme.
listen, Esso, I think you forget that there's a very important distinction. You see, Democrats want the income tax rate to be 30%, while Republicans want it to be 29%. You want a lower income tax, don't you?
I don't care what you're arguing. I care about the means that you're using and what sort of organizations exist in society.
But a 29%, but a 29% income tax would be better.
I mean, if you really want to get down to it, you can sort of cite my most recent essay where I point out there's not even a meaningful distinction in terms of how much autonomy people have away from the state in the framework of deregulation or tax cuts. It's just a different way of engineering the political economy because the state is still prescribing these rates and it still has the same claim over resources and how it defines resources being claimed legally that it did previously. The proper way, the only meaningful distinction to make between the state becoming more onerous openly and with deregulation is in an economic sense, and in an economic sense, deregulation and tax cuts represent a subsidy for the legal market and the political class of actors at the expense of the counter market, because it effectively takes away the value of the resources that they're trading and makes it essentially so only people with legal privilege have an easy time trading with them or can more effectively.
Mm-hmm. Well, you can see exactly how you can see this actually in both of those positions, rhetoric in terms of how they describe taxes. You have, for example, one group, who I'm not going to name, saying that any sort of tax or any sort of taxes that are not being paid to the government are a cost to the government, and therefore operating under the assumption that all revenue that people make or just earn for themselves is a salutary earning given charitably by the government, and it assumes that the government is entitled to all assets that people produce, while the other side only argues in favor of reducing taxes on the basis that it's more efficient and the government collects more revenue in the long run, therefore operating under the assumption that people don't actually earn their own money. It's just that we need to operate the state more efficiently. Again,
more aspects and more markets are incorporated into the legal market and the legal infrastructure that the state creates. And so therefore, more of the resources produced in that market will be done in the political infrastructure that the state's created.
Mm-hmm. It's just the same assumption that everything and every economic activity operates under the aegis of the state and is subject to confiscation at any point. They all completely agree on that aspect and arguing over marginal adjustments to certain integers here and there fundamentally does nothing to alter that calculation whatsoever. Since if it's 1% or 99%, it's still going to be operating under the same assumption that your assets belong to the government and are subject to government seizure at any point. Even if the government did determine that, oh, we're going to set income taxes to zero, well, they're still operating under the assumption that they are entitled to those assets at any time, and can easily just bring it up to 1%, 9%, or 200% at any point for whatever reason they wish. And it's all done completely unilaterally. So, yeah, I don't care about what the marginal rates are going to be, because the fact that they're even able to tax in the first place is the problem. It's not that it's too low or too high. But anyway, should we continue?
Sure.
All right.
I think we sent home the message pretty clearly that libertarianism is its separate approach to studying societies. But let's continue.
All right. Now, where's the thing? There it is.
Even the buffering of this video is boring.
Ludwig von Mises first articulated some of the main arguments against the possibility of socialism in 1920. He argued that the price system was essential for determining what to produce and how to produce it.
Can we pause for
It
a
is
second?
because of prices set through trade and market.
Sorry.
I'm not gonna. I don't have much to say here, but I do want to point out that they said this video was put out by the Mises Institute, and it very clearly wasn't. It was put out by just some guy. This is just some guy's explanation of the calculation argument. Although I would argue it's a pretty good explanation.
I'm squinting. I'm trying to see who made it, but the problem is you have the more videos button just lingering right on top of the channel name. But
yeah, thanks, YouTube. But it's just some channel called Adam G, and I don't know. They might be a partner of the Mises Institute, but I've never heard of them before.
Yeah, I don't think I know who they are either. And judging by the subscriber count, which is 219, I'm going to assume that they aren't. I mean,
right,
if he was a partner of the Mises Institute, you would think he would have at least 1,000. I know that
Roderick out by somebody,
and I know that Roderick Long's Agorist Cafe channel has around 700, I think, by now, and he's pretty well known in left libertarian circles, and has multiple articles on C4SS. So,
he's a contributor to the Mises Institute himself for like 15, 20 years. So, I mean, he has clout in that circle, even though he's no longer a part of it. Anyway, let's continue.
And how to produce it. It is because of prices set through trade in markets that producers know what the most efficient combination of inputs is, and prices adjusted through supply and demand tell consumers what is relatively abundant and what is relatively scarce. According to Mises, prices make rational economic decision-making possible. Thus, he wrote, quote, "Where there is no free market, there is no pricing mechanism. Without a pricing mechanism, there is no economic calculation." End quote. Moreover, prices change as some goods become relatively more or less scarce, and as technology or people's consumption preferences change. The price system makes it possible for producers and consumers to adjust their decisions and plans as economic circumstances change. Mises wrote that, quote, "In the socialist commonwealth, every economic change becomes an undertaking whose success can be neither appraised in advance nor later retrospectively determined. There is only groping in the dark. Socialism is the abolition of rational economy." End quote.
So, first, Professor Burgess, we'll go to you.
So, do you have any objection to that characterization of the calculation argument? I know that I personally don't like how it assumes that equilibrium models are legitimate, but that's just me being a Lockmanite. Anyway.
Yeah. So the problem I'm seeing was kind of it's probably more semantic, but it's kind of arguing under the assumption that this can only occur in a free market, where we can actually observe that there is at least some semblance of rational calculation in a even unfree market. This, as long as there is any semblance of private property whatsoever, there is some aspect of rational calculation can occur, at least to a certain extent. because the government intervention into economies always causes all sorts of distortions in terms of how prices occur. But we can still reasonably assume that the prices that currently exist, based on the interventions and regulations, restrictions, taxation, licensing, what have you, all of that intervention, that the prices that currently exist are a relatively reasonable way for people to rationally acquire goods and value goods on the basis of how they are relative to other goods in the economy or into any given economy.
The reason for that is because consumer input still exists, even though a lot of these prices, for instance, are administered, and you have things like you have these proprietary mechanisms either run directly by the state or set up by the state to sort of create a series of institutions that try and reinforce certain incentives that cause distortions and make it so resources are more scarce, and like I've pointed out previously in the stream. So this is something that Mises was kind of shaky on, but this is something that later Austrians, particularly Hayek, went on to sort of explore, and that is the idea that not every entrepreneur is the same. Not every market is the same. Not every economy is the same. Well, okay, because Mises understood that. He just he treated cardinal models though. So modeling like time scale or the size of the economy and what we're measuring as being prescribed by some institution, as opposed to those being factors determined by consumers and producers in a social sense. That's been expanded upon by more recent Austrian thinkers, and that's something that Mises was kind of shaky about.
Mm-hmm. And this is probably the main thing that I see being the problem with how this is presented, which is mainly that the extent of consumer inputs are kind of glossed over. And I think this is kind of one of those things where the refinements that would come later are going to help clarify this. But this is just the main issue I have with what's being presented. Most of the core of what's being argued for is factual, and that is, of course, the observation that organizations cannot exchange with themselves, and the socialist commonwealth, as it was put forward, is an example of a totalitarian model in which all assets are assumed to be owned by a single large monolithic hegemony, and as such has no ability to, or since it lacks any sort of market or consumers at all, it has no ability to rationally determine how much things cost, and without being able to determine prices, you can't efficiently allocate resources.
I mean, especially the early Austrian thinkers had a lot of problems in like their nuances in approaching how to study markets. But to be fair, they were sort of, they were entering into uncharted territory, because prior to the discovery of marginal utility, we were just kind of people were just operating around the assumption that things like intrinsic value existed, or the idea that you could operate around prescription rather than treating economics as a social science. But a good example of this would be the fact that Bob Bawerk, somebody who is still respected in Austrian circles, and I think he contributed a lot of great things, but his view on capital theory was incomplete. He didn't understand what inflation specifically was, and that's specifically why Mises is credited with pointing out things like when when new money is printed, it doesn't enter into the economy equally, which is what everybody basically prior to him was kind of just assuming in their models. And that's an important contribution to capital theory that Mises made specifically, and that's why inflation is now recognized as an effective redistribution mechanism. But we could continue, I guess.
Just before we do, Anarcho-Chadian said rational calculation could occur if bureaucrats were using the prices of goods in other countries to guide their economic output and distribution, which is not true at all. I mean, I can get why you'd come to that conclusion, but I mean the Stalin regime towards its tail end, before Khrushchev came to power, they were actually using the Sears catalog as an attempt to make sure that they were efficiently allocating resources, because the mathematical models they were trying to use were just absolutely terrible. And they found out that using the prices set in another country doesn't really make sense when your economy is not producing things at this. Your economy, or the Soviet economy, or Soviet economies, I should say, are not going to have the same supply and demand curves that the United States will. And even then, well, the Sears catalog is just going to be one particular basket of goods and services, and there's going to be others from local competitors as well as local producers who are going to be pricing things completely differently. So, no, you actually can't do that. They can certainly try, but they're going to be effectively using outdated information in a location that is completely foreign, with utterly different supply and demand curves than what is in their own country.
And different market incentives, not just in the political economy, but like the environment that people in those economies are trading around, that sort of informs how they should use their resources, or the availability of resources in that market compared to the availability of the resources in the Soviet legal economy. So, long story short, this gets back to what I was saying earlier. Not all economies are the same, so that can't be a solution.
I think we've discussed earlier, like the water and diamonds example of explaining why it is that goods and services can only be valued subjectively. Because if you have like a totalitarian desert economy and a free market, just temperate country, they're going to value those goods and services completely differently. And so they could pick up, say, the Sears catalog, or the totalitarian desert country can pick up the Sears catalog or their equivalent thereof from the temperate free market, and find that water for them is valued incredibly cheaply, whereas water in their economy is, of course, going to be very scarce and valued significantly more highly. But because they're using a foreign market incentives, as you said, foreign supply and demand curves, they're still going to have a very significant amount of market distortion, especially if they try to treat that catalog as gospel truth and significantly underprice the water that they do have relative to its actual demand, and you have a situation of huge shortages for that reason. So anyways, I think we should continue. Or do you have anything more to add?
Yeah, that would be like trying to look at how plants grow in the tropics as a way to plan how you should set up a plantation in a completely different climate. I mean, there are obvious differences. For instance, we're comparing economic planning to people setting up a farm, but the principle I'm trying to illustrate is just how nonsensical it would be to do that. Anyway, let's continue.
All right.
Professor Wolff will land this home as well. But I just want to say at the outset, my response, not as a logic professor or economist, is this is great proof against the European accents make you sound smart argument. Go ahead.
Yeah, fair enough. Now, I will say that I don't think that this argument, like last week, a few days ago we were talking about the argument for the non-aggression principle. I think that's just total nonsense. Once you kind of realize the trick at the heart of it, then it's just not compelling at all anymore. This is a little bit better because it does track.
So an argument from time. Also, as I pointed out, this doesn't really have anything to do with the non-aggression principle, because the study of markets from the Austrian perspective does not necessitate having particular views about politics.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add to that. I'm kind of curious as to what his Burgess's response to the NAP is, and I can guarantee you it's a reply to Thin Boys. But I'm also kind of expecting it to just be dumb. So I'm also kind of don't want to watch it either.
Well, it's not really relevant to this stream. We might watch it next week, because I would imagine the Friday stream, we're not going to have enough time to go over it if we did cover it. Nah. Anybody in chat think that's a good idea?
We're asking the chat. And we don't have the delay, so yeah, they haven't said anything
yet. Okay, let's continue.
Okay.
While we wait for the chat.
Extent some real problems in the Soviet model, at least of socialism, with lining up consumer preferences with production decisions. But as a matter of logic, what really hits me about this is if you take it the way that Hayek and von Mises took it, and the way that these guys who made the video are taking it, as an argument against socialism. That's how it's usually presented. We have to have capitalism. We can't have socialism. Sorry, whatever the problems of capitalism are, we've got to keep the capitalist class, in charge forever, because otherwise we're going to run into this problem. It's committing the false dilemma fallacy.
Well, no, you're the one inaccurately characterizing what Austrians are necessarily arguing. Because for one, Austrians don't inherently have views about organization or political models. In fact, it's the negation of them. I think that it would be weird. It would be weird for the political class. And I guess we could make the distinction between characterizing these market actors as a political class and a capitalist class, because capitalist class implies that they emerged naturally out of market incentives, which is just nonsensical. There's no way within an economically competitive framework, free of any sort of intervention, that you could suppress other people from acting, or you could create these sort of legal privileges to externalize your costs or protect you from other people defending themselves, like political actors in the market enjoy now. And a way that a lot of Marxists try and band-aid that is, these market actors co-opt the state, which is used to protect the market, which aside from that just being circular reasoning, it also is incoherent, because it assumes not only that all market actors have a sort of hegemonic set of interests, which is undermined by the observation of economic competition itself. But it also implies that states are neutral of interests as organizations, which that's been one of the things both of us, and in fact the libertarian perspective, is mostly critical of. The idea that these states are just sort of interest neutral actors that exist because people want them to be around and operate in the ways that people want them to.
Now, I'm looking at the chat, and there's a few things. First off, it was pretty predictable that they were going to just go capitalism. So yeah, that's a good prediction right there. Another one is people are saying no, we shouldn't watch it because it's not worth watching, and it's basically just apparently he just tries to make the appeal. Well, what about positive liberties? Don't you want to feel positive, you guys? Yeah, positivity is good. That's basically the extent of their argument. Well, not literally, but they just said like his anti-nap argument, him being Ben Burgess, is about positive liberty. But I don't think he actually makes the argument about positivity. That's just me being playful. But yeah, people don't think it's going to be worth watching. Also, apparently, Michael Brooks is dead.
He is?
Yeah, I was looking it up earlier just to verify. He died on July 20th this year of apparently a blood clot, which means that his death was reported as a COVID-19 death. I actually don't know if it was reported as a COVID death, but considering that the criteria for COVID death is you basically die, then yeah, we can guarantee that his blood clot was probably caused by COVID.
All right, well, rip. I don't wish the dude any ill will, even though he, given the sort of camp of people he allied himself with, I'm very skeptical of the notion that he would offer me the same courtesy if I were the one who died. But yeah, I don't frankly know enough about him to harbor any sort of feelings like that. But yeah, he it makes it kind of difficult to like him as well with his sort of Dunning-Kruger act he's putting on in this stream and presumably any other stream where he attempts to approach straw man arguments of positions he didn't like.
Mm-hmm. And just to go back to what we were addressing the stream directly, well, yeah, everything that Burgess is putting forward in regards to what Mises is saying is literally nothing that Mises is actually saying. He never says the capitalist class, never even talks about socialism. He only uses the socialist commonwealth as an example of central planning and explains why central planning does not work. This applies, as we explained earlier, this applies to literally any large organization. As also explained earlier, makes no commentary about any particular capitalist class. It's all just pure projection.
Yeah, or it's an attempt to ascribe views to Mises and the Austrians, which they don't actually hold, which is what I was pointing out a moment ago.
Well, that's why I asked if they used the term neoliberal in this video earlier, because you know that they were just going to try to pigeonhole people that they disagree with into a single ideology that nobody actually believes.
Yeah, I pointed that out before the stream even started, that's the main reason they were able to keep the length of their reply down to 15 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And they've also referenced like capitalism and socialism, which are both anti-concepts, but I guess we'll let them continue.
All right. Continuing.
The assumption is that either we have the exact form of socialism, the way of understanding socialism they had in the USSR, or we have capitalism, and those are the only options. And of course, those are not the only options. It's not Soviet socialism or no socialism. It's, there are lots of things that smart socialists have said about how these decisions could be run in a post-capitalist economy.
Just very quickly, before he gets into those, can I also note how he's characterizing basically what we have now as quote-unquote capitalism, and what the Austrian position they defend as being a quote-unquote capitalist position. Heretic and I have argued the radically free market position that's put forward by the Austrians and would be defended in the libertarian framework would fundamentally negate the idea of not only any sort of political class or political infrastructure, But it would also argue, therefore, against essentially all of these institutions which attempt to prescribe economic frameworks that we have created by the state and defended by the state. And I know I've mentioned that a couple of times now, but it's an important point to hammer home. If anything, Marxists are defending the status quo because they don't want anything to change. They just want the state to pay lip service to different ideals.
Didn't really have anything to add to that. So anyways...
But yeah, let's let him attempt to list off the different socialist arguments that have been proposed in attempt to respond to Mises.
Oh, but don't forget, these are smart socialist positions, as opposed to, the dumb socialist positions of the USSR, I suppose.
Simplest and most obvious is that, what the kind of thing that like Bhaskar Sankara will talk about when he talks about socialism, where and a lot of people in the DSA will talk about, where you have certain key commanding heights are nationalized. And, of course, we have abundant evidence from throughout the world, from lots of countries in the West, that there are things like healthcare that have been very nicely provided in a non-market way, right? So that we can have an economy where...
I mean, in the sense that prior to these licensing schemes being created for the pharmaceutical industry and the healthcare market, you had things like mutual aid communities, fraternal societies that were like membership programs for people, and healthcare was provided that way in those organizations. If people wanted a doctor, they could just have a doctor sent to their house. In that sense, sure, but I wouldn't really say that's a non-market solution. In fact, I would say that was a market solution. And what we have right now is basically I wouldn't go as far as to say it's an anti-market. It's an anti-market system. It's just a system, which means necessarily there's some sort of prescription. But yeah, I think that it's laughable if you look at the NHS or any other state-run program. Even looking at the U.S., which they consider laughably to be, they laughably consider to just not be state-managed. That there is an abundance of problems, mainly that they, just aside from the fact that they don't operate around any sort of price signals, so they're forced to resort to rationing. But that incentive to ration leads to some pretty disgusting things, like doctors going out of their way to try and kill people to save resources, for instance, or ambulances not being called to pick people up who are injured if said person who is injured is fat or has a lot of previously existing problems, the sort of thing that these planners argue is a problem with market incentives in healthcare.
I think I remember in 2013 that Parliament in the UK passed legislation that mandated that no one in an NHS hospital could be in a waiting room for longer than 6 hours, because apparently that was a big-ass problem. And so what they ended up doing was that they would have a person being brought into an ambulance just sit in the ambulance for hours at a time until staff at the hospital told them that they could be expected to be in a room in less than 6 hours, in which case they would bring them in. And keep in mind, the ambulance would still be on, which of course you would think would upset a lot of environmentalists, a vehicle being kept idle and producing carbon dioxide emissions and greenhouse gases. Not to mention that you just have an ambulance which could be used to pick up someone else who might need an emergency, just basically sitting there doing nothing just to get around that kind of legislation. To say nothing of the fact that, well, I'm sure you remember that story I think it was like a year ago or two, it came out that NHS hospitals were using aborted babies to fuel their furnaces.
Yeah. And by the way, we can link these stories like in resources or in the comments of the re-upload that'll be up later on the Backalley channel of the stream. Well, it's not a re-upload, but we're going to be clipping some of the best parts of this. And but just what I was going to say is I don't know what the fuck this guy is talking about. If you go to any country that has essentially the state commanding the healthcare market or the pharmaceutical industry directly, so there's not even like a shell market set up, which is ultimately run by cartels and state agencies like in the U.S. It's literally the biggest issue of any like political conversation in those countries. Their healthcare systems are fucked, and elect me, I'll fix it. I don't know what this guy's like. I'd imagine they're just sort of playing around the fact that most of the people who watch the stream probably don't know, ironically, are not familiar with anything outside of the framework of U.S. politics. But yeah, if you just look at the attitudes people have towards state-run hospitals in countries that have them, I don't think that we could argue that. It's pretty obvious to argue something's wrong for sure.
I can guarantee you this guy's been to a Cuban hospital. And I'm saying that because I'm remembering in Michael Moore's Sicko that it was supposed to be this criticism of U.S. healthcare system. He brought cameras to a Cuban hospital to showcase how clean it was, how nice and professional staff were, how modern their equipment is. Except that was a Cuban hospital for like politicians and the politically connected. The actual hospitals that people day to day go to are actually worse than government schools in the United States somehow, with barely anything resembling sterile equipment, let alone equipment whatsoever. It's just absolutely horrid. And I would imagine that if they have ever been to a foreign country to see what their healthcare system is like, they were basically given a tour of the Potemkin city.
Yeah, comparing that to comparing those hospitals in countries like Cuba to government schools in the U.S. would almost be a compliment. I mean, if anything, they're more like the asylums in horror movies. That's what they look like. No, I'm sure that any of the extensively documented evidence of how shitty these things are would just be dismissed as capitalist propaganda. At the same time, anybody who is skeptical of government incentives by a lot of these same idiots would be considered a conspiracy theorist, and that would be grounds on which to dismiss their perspective, because these people aren't really looking, and the people in the political framework, people who are just looking they're just looking for justifications for whatever like policy prescription is being advertised to whatever they perceive their interests to be. They don't look at this as a science. They don't look at this as a study. They just are looking for things to pick up on that could help them justify what they believe to themselves is ultimately what it is.
And we can speculate endlessly about what their motives are, why they're so interested in it, but it seems to me that they have a perspective that is so absurd, insane, ridiculous that could only come from academia, because it is so out of touch with the actual day-to-day lives of people, as well as the actual workings of monopolies on healthcare, that, as I said before, it can only come from an academic. I mean, it's funny because I had a small conversation in the back alley I don't remember if it was yesterday or today, about, what was it? It was something related to healthcare. The idea is that healthcare seems to be one of the only industries in a given economy where you actually get more efficiency and lower cost when you have both a monopoly producer and a monopoly consumer. And I've never been able to hear it. I've been pushing back against this even when I was a conservatard, because I realized that argument was just wrong. Like, why that ever is how that could possibly be the case out of any other industry that could ever exist in the economy. Why is it that whenever you have food as a monopoly consumer and producer, there are shortages and it becomes more expensive? When you have manufacturing done by a monopoly in both the consumers and producers, you have less of it, lower quality, and it's more expensive. But when you get to healthcare, suddenly a switch flips and things become cheaper and more efficient.
Yeah, state socialists are not even internally consistent about this, because they cite things like trade embargoes, actions taken by other states to make it more difficult for states that those states in question don't really like, that's specifically supposed to deprive their political economies of resources by using the force of the state. They cite that as being something that has negative impact on the market. So, but this is sort of state socialists are a lot like progressives in this regard. How progressives still effectively argue for eugenics, even though they frame what they're arguing for as being in the aims of achieving social justice causes. State socialists argue in favor of the same thing that they did back in the 19th century, except back in the 19th century, when they were applauding the state creating artificial scarcity and making it so only a few politically connected producers could cartelize markets. They applauded that on the grounds that, well, you could only trust elected representatives to produce these things.
Whoa.
They sort of what?
Nothing. It's just that there was a very loud feedback from your microphone. It sounded like you just screeched suddenly.
Ooh, okay. I don't know why that would have been, but sorry, anybody who is watching. Yeah, they sort of downplayed that entailment of their position, or outright denied that that's what their position entails, even though functionally what they're arguing is no different than what they argued in the 19th century, and no consistent or major discoveries have been made which uproot that fundamental observation about how resources enter markets, or how resources are produced, which would create a rational case for treating state cartelization and monopolization as anything other than forces which leverage certain actors over others and create artificial scarcity.
All right. And I think we talked about all we need to on this. Should we continue?
Sure.
Some elements are planned outside the market. That test has been done very successfully. And that, if we do need a market sector, that those could be organized as workers' cooperatives instead of traditional hierarchical corporations. That's one way around this. Another way around this is Michael Albert and Robin Hanhel talk about participatory economics, Paracon. And Hanhel is the kind of economist who will give you efficiency equations for his proposed system.
No, you dumb motherfucker. You cannot get around a problem inherent to planning by creating another layer of planning.
Well, you see, we just need to plan. We just need an infinite recursion of planning, and that'll solve everything, I promise.
I mean, as what he said about worker cooperatives. I don't like how he sort of insinuated that they would be set up by the state. Sure, in local economies, that might be a profitable model for some people, and but that wouldn't be an anti-market exchange. It also fundamentally wouldn't, it wouldn't have any other than the implications for the incentives of the actors in that model. Personally, I think that worker cooperatives are just a shittier version of the model that dominates in modernity, because every single person working in said firm would have a higher sense of risk associated with operating that firm, and indeed, if anything went wrong, that would directly affect their sense of profit. But that wouldn't be operating outside of supply and demand. So I don't know why that's being treated as something that flips what Mises said onto its head. But just back to what we were talking about earlier, this is the kind of thing that I was talking about before we started that illustrates perfectly how Marxists do not understand the calculation argument. They do not understand because they don't understand the calculation argument, because they don't understand that the Austrians are treating the study of markets differently than the other schools of economic thought. They're treating it as a social science where we're supposed to be observing the incentives of the people who are actually producing resources and consuming them. Because of that, you can't have a model that operates independently of people producing or consuming things. That negates the concept of production and consumption itself.
If your planning is necessarily going to be done by people who are just simply not participating in the economies that they're trying to be planning over, and as such, you're completely disconnected from the signals that would even be necessary for the planning to be somewhat effective whatsoever, to say nothing of the fact that the signals that would be necessary for economic resources to be allocated efficiently cannot possibly exist in a planned economy. It just does not work. But yeah, go ahead. Just try to add another layer of planning and see if you can't figure out some way around this. I'm sure if you do enough experimentation, if you tinker around with your little equations long enough, you'll be able to figure out like maybe at the 2,791,930th plan in your infinite recursion, you would have figured out that maybe you can finally get it down. But of course, by then we'll have already become a Type 4 civilization. So yeah, let us know when you're finished.
But yeah, according to these buffoons, Milton Friedman, Ayn Rand, and basically Adam Smith all had the same views on not just markets, but philosophy and ethical views and quote unquote libertarianism, because that's how this shit works, apparently.
This is a result of the kind of philosophical inbreeding that you're talking about, and I gotta get used to using that term because honestly it's a phenomenal term. But yeah, once you do have this very insular understanding and this constant circle jerking of ideas going back and forth, it becomes very easy to lose any kind of nuance in your opponent's view. And nuance is extremely helpful since it allows you to be able to, when you're engaged in argumentation, to be able to address the opponent's views as they actually are, as opposed to your own straw man version of it. Which is, of course, why they're trying very desperately to pigeonhole Mises and the economic calculation problem in general into their own Marxian understanding of what Mises thinks, as opposed to what he actually thinks and what he actually says. They can't comprehend that people think outside themselves because they personally don't know anyone who doesn't think the way they do.
Because, guys, Milton Friedman enjoys a lot of criticism from Austrians for the same reason that Marx did. Because fundamentally, monetarists, which is what Milton Friedman was, approach from the same sort of prescriptive angle that causes the modern way that markets are sort of organized and the state in general to draw the ire of the Austrians. And Austrians are just as, if not more, critical of monetarists than Marxists are, except the main difference being that the Austrians' criticism of the monetarists aren't completely fucking stupid. All right, we can continue.
All right, where's the thing? There it is.
Spent a lot of time here taking about it because I'm really curious to get Professor Wolff's thoughts. But if you look that up, participatory economics, Paracon, that's another model. And I think a third model is the kind of thing that Professor Wolff talks about in his book, Democracy at Work, The Cure for Capitalism, which is that you could have these workers' self-directed enterprises that are maybe ambiguous between workers' cooperatives as we know them and having the public take a stake in them. But maybe that would be a good time for Professor Wolff to jump in.
All right, Dipset. Professor Wolff, please.
Okay, let me organize my thoughts about it around two things. If I heard correctly at the beginning, this was a report on something that came from von Mises in 1920. So let me be generous and assume that he was suffering from the fact that he was talking about what socialism could or couldn't achieve before it had had a chance to do so, since the revolution was in 1917.
No,
there was
because you can't talk about what someone else is proposing and their models unless those models are put in place, even if you can identify problems with them in their proposal. Even from an empiricist standpoint, you can criticize someone else's models without having to actually physically construct those models. But yeah, like I said earlier, there is absolutely no way Richard Wolff has ever had a job outside of academia, and most certainly he does not understand the calculation argument or even the Austrian methodology.
Which is very unfortunate, but it's also worth pointing out that history has vindicated Mises' observation, although it did need some refinement, and it did. His general observation that you can't have efficient economic allocation when a single monolithic organization owns all the resources is absolutely accurate. And
it was a consistent problem throughout the U.S., throughout the Soviet Union's existence. That's the reason why the Soviet Union basically banned study on the Austrian methodology. And it's a problem which, as I've pointed out, plagues not just any state in modern society today, but these political cartelized models set up by states themselves. It is a continual problem that we can see playing out today. If you've ever actually worked a real job, by real job, I mean in the white market, like Walmart, you can literally you can observe the effects of diseconomy of scale just based on the incentives you have. People knocking things off the shelves. They're supposed to report those things. They just sort of brush it under the shelf that they're stocking because reporting it would be a conflict of interest. Even though that's important for resource allocation of the firm. Aside from the fact that these principles have been vindicated in pretty much any way you look at it, if you are just if you are operating in the areas of society most people are familiar with, you can see the Austrian observations about incentives all around you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's see here. Don't really have much to add to that. Continuing.
Followed by a
Sure.
civil war, an invasion by other countries. It didn't really get out of a war condition until 1922. Lenin died in 1923, so it's really a you have to wonder what he's talking about when he talks about socialism not working in.
It's funny because the Soviet Union was in a constant state of war through the entirety of its existence. It sure had periods of peace here and there, but it's the same thing with any totalitarian regime where they need to justify themselves on the basis that they're under threat, and it's protection against this threat that justifies the regime.
It wasn't at war with another country. It was trying to expand its claimed territories into another state's territory. So basically, if the USSR wasn't at war, it was trying to start war with with another government.
Mm-hmm.
Also, there's another name. There's a name for that. It's called imperialism.
What?
And
That's ridiculous. The communists are never imperialistic. Communists only criticize imperialism. So how can a communist socialist economy ever be anything resembling imperialistic?
See, when a government which uses Marxism as its sort of stated tool of legitimacy in its constitution, when a Marxist government does it, we don't call it imperialism, we call it liberation.
Ah, right. I forgot. If you just change the terms around, then everything is completely perfect. So I guess we can justify the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan by the United States government on the basis of it being called peacekeeping. I mean, that makes just sense, right?
Yeah, and something I was going to point out is that the more the states can never completely plan every aspect of the of their market, because that will just cause the political economy to collapse in on itself. So at some point, there's always going to be at least there's going to be one political industry which is just where there's just like a series of cartels trying to engineer the infrastructure, but people um, effectively are operating around quote unquote their own autonomous resources, however the state chooses to define legal ownership. But yeah, the more central planning that a government engages in, the more of an incentive they have to be imperialistic. Because the thing with political economies is that it's not strictly true that the zero sum incentive obviously exists in economic theory. But if you look at the incentives of political actors and these institutions that are set up by the state, well, they do operate around a zero sum model because their resources are, they distribute them based on rationing schemes. So states that increasingly do that seek to absorb more resources into themselves through imperialism. This is why when most of the world was operating around mercantilist models, when most of the governments were operating around mercantilist models, and they were deliberately constructing these labyrinthian political economies to make it as difficult to trade between villages inside of the Roman Empire as possible. That was typically what they did whenever the government thought that they needed more resources and they wanted to get some. Just go to Africa and colonize some new country in Africa, or go east and take over India. That was the reason they did that, is because mercantilism is just an even more shitty version of the Soviet model.
It's just it's just required to have a pillaging based economy. You just take what you need from other societies and then hope that you have the manpower and the resources to be able to fund that military expenditure. It's, well, I mean, the best way to put it is that it's wretched. And it's also what's going on here. I mean, I don't really have much more to add to that.
I can continue, I guess.
Yeah.
In 1920. I'm trying to be nice. I'm trying to be nice.
It's the post game. Please don't be nice, Professor
Okay.
Wolff.
Then we have countries that call themselves socialist, the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. Let's take them at their word for the moment. They are socialist. What did their non-rational groping in the dark, to quote him, what did it accomplish? In the case of the Soviet Union, it was the fastest economic growth in the history of the human race.
Oh my God.
You know what the Soviet Union was actually like? It was the Chinese, and I realize, like, in China's case it's literally Chinese, but it was a bootlegged version of industrialism in Europe and America. For lack of a better term, they were essentially copying their homework. It got to the point where I think it was in World War II, where there was a bomber that was going to be doing a run over Japan, but they were stationed in Europe. And so what they did was they got permission from the Soviet Union to have them fly over Russia to get to Japan, and they had to stop in some Soviet airfield to refuel. The Soviet Union actually took the plane, dismantled it, and Stalin ordered to have every part of that plane replicated and reproduced. And so they took the plane, took it apart, molded it, figured out what materials it was made of, like every part of it, and then reassembled it, refueled the plane, and then let the bomber pilot and bomber crew go back on their mission. And when they reproduced the plane, what they ended up with is an exact copy of that plane, down to the serial numbers printed on the metal. It was they really had no ability, like no incentives towards actual technological development, and simply all they could do was just send spies and send agents to industry to just copy what it was that the West was doing and then take that. So if you're transitioning from an entirely agrarian, quasi-feudalist society to an industrial society over the course of a decade as opposed to several centuries, yeah, you're going to see a lot of economic growth. But you know what? Happened in the United States and the West, or you know what the Soviet Union did have that the United States and the West did not? Daily news reports about how crops and agriculture was doing. Now, you have to wonder why that's important, and I need you to think about how often you see on the news reports about how plentiful, or how reports about what the weather is going to be like in agricultural sectors or in agricultural areas, how plentiful certain crop yields are doing. And this was something that was happening daily. They did that because it was something that people actually cared about, because food was very scarce in the Soviet Union. Very scarce. And as such, their agricultural yields, that was something of grave importance, because there was no guarantee that there was even going to be enough food to feed people. With this in mind, not to say nothing of the fact that, well, a lot of the Soviet Union's economic numbers are outright fabricated. And I think we've talked about that quite a bit, where they would just like adjust their numbers, either play with the statistics or even just manufacture things. Like there was a period, I think there was a period of famine in the 60s where like a huge sector of their economy just collapsed in 1 year. and they still reported a net GDP growth of throughout the entire year of a very significant amount.
That's that's what I was about to add, aside from pointing out what you just did, which was the Russian Empire to the Soviet Union was a mercantilist model, transitioning to basically a quasi-mercantilist industrial model. So I mean, you're gonna have a hard time not having some people's quality of life improve, because you're literally transitioning from a model which operates around the assumption that trade inside the nation should be discouraged, and where the state sets up as many barriers as possible to deliberately try and stop that from happening. But what I was going to add is basically he's just making the Samuelson argument. And up until the 80s, because of Paul Samuelson, Wolff doesn't mention Samuelson by name, but basically, because of him, Keynesians were pointing to the Soviet Union and were trying to argue, well, it's as influential as the United States or any other developed so-called nation. It was operating around essentially the efficiency expert mode of a political economy. But yeah, because of that, they were attempting to argue that the Soviet Union was some sort of utopia, and that's sort of the basis today Marxists use to argue that a lot of the media coverage of it was propaganda. To some extent, it might have been, but the fact of the matter is that post 1950, the Soviet Union was basically in a constant Great Depression. Actually, a mode of operation that was like worse than the Great Depression. I know I shouldn't talk about it in mode with terms like mode of operation. But you get my point, that there was more poverty than Great Depression era America, to the point where even by the 70s, millions of people were still starving because there wasn't food.
Mm-hmm.
Because food wasn't available. So the idea that it was just this prosperous utopia is nonsensical, and the reason this is actually a great example why GDP figures cannot be used in general, but especially can't be used as an attempt to measure economic development or prosperity of people living in a particular nation.
Now, in fairness, we don't know that they're citing GDP figures, but it's a reasonable inference considering we're dealing with small brains here.
He actually does cite GDP figures.
He probably does later. But anyways, he's probably going to go into China and just how of a great, wonderful, free, and prosperous society China has become as a result of state planning.
Not bad for an economic system to go from being the poorest country in Europe, the old man of Europe, to becoming by 1975, despite 2 world wars fought on its territory, a civil war, a second civil war around the collectivization of agriculture, tremendous strains. By 1975, it's the number 2 economic power in the world after the United States. As economic growth goes, this is a pretty impressive record for socialism.
Particularly if you're in the dark.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, we talked about this already, so there's no reason to address it again. But as we pointed out, like, all they really did was just make a carbon copy of Western goods, Western services, Western processes and industries, and then they try to claim it as their own. Which
I also would like to point out that Wolff, before he mentioned all these points, he said, "Well, let's give it the benefit of the doubt that this is socialist." So basically, if you were to point out a more nuanced take on this and all the problems. If you were to sort of pin him down with somebody were to come along afterwards and pin him down with the problems with the Soviet Union, he's basically setting up the ability to say, you don't understand my argument.
Oh yeah, like I actually forgot that he mentioned that. But yeah, he is definitely he's been being very clever there, trying to dig his own escape route. He's going to say, well, I don't believe the Soviet Union is actual socialism, but listen to how great socialism is by how much growth the Soviet Union had.
And that's stuff like that is really, it's really telling, at the very least, what Wolff himself thinks of what he's saying, because that's a common pattern you'll notice in a lot of Richard Wolff's arguments is they're rhetorically structured before he makes them in a way that he could sort of try to worm his way around predictable criticisms that his position has faced previously and would continue to face. And in some of the debates that he's had, like with David Friedman, he's been presented with positions that he's argued for. For instance, he defended a state-run he pointed to a state-run co-op in fascist Spain as an example of his ideal co-op model. So he was literally defending a state-backed industry by a fascist regime. And he, I can't remember the name of the corporation off the top of my head, but he tried to distance himself, just saying, well, I don't support that position now. He's gone on since then to not give any indication in effectively what he's arguing that he has changed his position. So Richard Wolff comes off to me like he doesn't even believe half of the shit that he's saying. And for the other half of what you could arguably claim he honestly believes, he doesn't have a very solid grasp on what the hell he's talking about. Richard Wolff, if you tell me that like Richard Wolff is your favorite economist, or you even come to me talking about Richard Wolff as a serious intellectual, like that just, to me, that is an indication that I should be more scrupulous of your arguments, because that reflects poorly on you if you think of this guy as anything more than a clown, because that's how he argues and that's how he puts forward his positions, much like that of a clown.
Mm-hmm. Anyways, continuing.
But there is one that did better, and that's called the People's Republic of China, which, by the way, is another one of these socialist experiments. It has now become the second power and arguably on its way to becoming the first power as the old first power sinks. And it also uses socialism to describe itself. So on empirical grounds, goodness. Now, I know that some of my colleagues...
All right, so what can we say about China?
Well, that there are, it's basically the different provinces and the different cities. It's run very much like a fascist political model, is what I was going to say about it, long story short. Where the state tries to, it operates pretty explicitly around the notion that it is going to prescribe incentives to certain areas, and those areas are where all of the, depending on what areas they're talking about, those are the areas that people of a certain political status can live and operate within. So if you're an enemy of the state, you're going to get moved to this province where you're basically going to get put in a gulag if you even so much as breathed the wrong way. Or you could get shipped off to a North Korean slave labor camp, which is another economy that China's sort of district prescription of incentives strongly resembles the way that the provinces in North Korea are divided up. But you have areas like Shenzhen where basically it's all the problems with the US political economy, and then some, because a lot more of the Chinese economy is planned and nationalized.
To say nothing of the fact that you have a whole crap ton of humanitarian problems. I'm sure everyone by now has heard of the Uyghur concentration camps that China is using, where they kidnapped just huge population of that entire demographic, and then are using them for slave labor. And when they die, either because they're straight up murdered or because they're worked to death, their organs get harvested and then sold on the organ red market throughout the world. That's absolutely fucking barbaric. But you also have the peasants who, like, there's hundreds of millions of them. What people don't realize is that the overwhelming majority of the Chinese people live in just abject third world poverty still. They want to present China as this like advanced industrial economy, but nothing could be further from the truth. The only reason that their GDP numbers look as large as they do is because they exploit one of the numerous flaws in GDP decision making or in GDP calculation, which is government spending, by having the government work on these massive projects to develop. I'm pretty sure everyone here is also familiar with the ghost cities, these massive cities built in the countryside with huge apartment complexes, skyscrapers, a whole power grid, everything, hydroelectric power. But these ghost cities are, they're called ghost cities because nobody lives in them, or rather their populations are in like the thousands at most. Hugely overdeveloped, and they largely just hugely overdeveloped and largely just left fallow. They just keep building them under the assumption that, under the belief of if they build it, they would come, but because of the economic calculation problem that they're trying to debunk, they actually have no frickin' idea if people actually want these cities or not. They kind of just hope that the cities create the prosperity somehow. The idea sorry.
Yeah, just aside from just that, really fundamentally the issue, like I sort of referred to both planning by cartelization and planning by direct management as planning. So I just wanted to clarify that, I am referring, I am taking into account the difference between those two models. And yes, China mostly plans its economy through cartelization, although, as Heretic pointed out, they have a very sort of commanding approach to how resources are harvested and how resources enter the market. And if your idea of China is some like robust city with trains and a lot of technology, because that is the way that China gets portrayed even in US media, what you're probably thinking of is Beijing or Shenzhen, and most of China is not like Beijing or Shenzhen. In fact, those are both examples of the of autonomous zones, which are areas where the state makes special exceptions for them, to where politically connected partners in that area can produce with lower, the state's going to tax their what they produce less, and it's going to be and there are some departments that don't operate in those areas.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, there is something else I wanted to add, and this happened actually just a few days ago. This is an article from Zero Hedge on the 15th of just this month. So this happened 3 or 4 days ago, where a $151 million state-owned coal mining company, Yangchen Coal and Electricity Holding Group, had recently, last month, gotten a AAA score on their credit rating, which, if you're not aware, is the highest possible credit rating you could possibly have, they defaulted just completely out of the blue. And keep in mind, this is a coal mining company in a country that is trying to rapidly develop as quickly as China is, and is one of the largest consumers of energy in the world. How you could possibly go bankrupt as a coal mining company is something unbelievable, actually.
That's, something that, has kind of been pausing me. I've been pausing to think about as I've been talking about China, because I've been like sitting here thinking about, well, a lot of the things that, China's criticized for, even within sort of the Austrian mainstream, those are things that the U.S. government does as well. It's just the main difference is that, of course, the Chinese government owns a lot of the market actors. So that causes some more problems with their resource management. Mm-hmm. But like the social credit system, for instance, that basically is the finance industry in the U.S. And that's how the state uses it too. Just look at Operation Mockingbird. Not Mockingbird, but Operation
Choke Point.
Choke Point's the one I was thinking of. So many gay ops that they get confused. The names of them get jumbled up. But yeah, so I think that to a large extent, the U.S. government and the Chinese government share. It's kind of blurry to argue differences in their incentives based on their organizational model. Mm-hmm. The political model that both of the governments constructed for themselves. I'm having a lot of difficulty pointing to differences in anything other than name.
Well, I mean, the difference is that China has socialism in their name, so China good, but United States is ostensibly capitalist, and the people that defend the United States call it capitalist. The conservatards call it capitalist, so therefore U.S. bad. And that's basically as far as their understanding goes. Everything that they argue and theorize is built upon that presuppositional framework. And well, when you build your house on sand, you shouldn't be surprised when it sinks. But
that's not a new realization to me by any means. It's just that the way that people talk about like the difference between the U.S. and the Chinese government. Fundamentally, I mean, they're different governments, sure, but in terms of how they operate, they're remarkably similar to one another. I mean, if people in the chat are going to point out, well, the U.S. doesn't have slave labor camps. I mean, yes, they fucking do. Look at ICE facilities and look at prisons. They have actual slave labor in them.
Slave labor is involuntary labor, not labor without pay. So yeah, I mean, the prison system absolutely is slave labor, and even more hilariously, in prisons they make Blue Line merchandise. So, I mean, talk about irony. Victims of the Blue Line having to make propaganda for the Blue Line. Anyways, let's continue.
React to this embarrassment, embarrassing Mr. von Mises and others like him, by announcing that the good results in China.
You are not in any position to be calling anyone else's research embarrassing. Richard Wolff, Mr. I don't understand the difference between wages and salaries. Mr. Yanis Varoufakis was a student of mine. Mr. I'm a Marxist.
I say we call him by his proper name.
What is that?
Dick Furry.
Yeah, you wanted to put that in the title of the stream, and I knew that people wouldn't click on the stream if you titled it that. But
yeah, that's fair. But
we could call him Dick Furry from now on. Sure.
I mean, it's usually reserved for people who deserve mockery, and that's the best antidote to totalitarianism. That is humor. If you mock someone in some way, give them a very silly name, then it's really hard to take them as seriously. And so, with this mind, with someone with a clearly as totalitarian a mindset as Dick Furry does, giving him that absolutely ridiculous name, I think it's very appropriate.
Yeah, Richard Wolff, Sir Dick Furry, whatever we want to call you. You don't even recognize that market producers have different incentives from one another. Like, bruh.
I don't think he's capable of understanding that. I don't even think he can articulate what a market is. I don't even know if he's actually visited a marketplace in his entire life. And I don't mean just like gone to a flea market. I mean, does he even ever go to the grocery store?
I mean, he's an academic, so he probably has enough money he can go pay like an intern or something to go get food for him. It would honestly not surprise me if he doesn't if he literally just lives in the university he works for and doesn't ever leave it.
He probably has a kitchen that he just pays someone to stock, as well as pays the cost of stocking it, and so he's completely divorced from any kind of interaction with even white market actors or even like white market firms. He just has these things done and just assumes that this is what socialism would be like. It would just be exactly the same, where food magically comes out of nowhere, and waffles would just grow from waffle trees.
And interns would be provided to him against their will by the state, as opposed to him having to have a creepy more than mentor, but for legal reasons, leaving it at mentorship relationship with them.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's continue then.
All right.
Yeah, and probably they would extend the argument to Russia, are in fact due to the extent of private enterprise and markets being allowed in, particularly to China in recent decades. But that's a game in which whatever is good is associated with whatever you like, and whatever is bad is associated with whatever you don't like. This is
no, it's
the pot calling the kettle black, which is honestly a terrible analogy, but you know what I mean.
Well, no, I mean that's pretty close to what it is, but no, this is like Richard Wolff ignoring questions or outright just denouncing questions of what counts as a particular principle, or just basic cause and effect relationships, things that that by itself is not a complete is not something that's complete to understand a science, especially as a social science. But basically, he's arguing essentially that causes don't matter, that what counts as a principle, or what principles, the validity of trying to compare the validity of one principle to another, that's not something you can do. Just look at the data and presuppose, based on what data sets you're looking at, that whatever a conclusion you've assumed is true before trying to prove it is demonstrated by whatever data set. Why? Because sensory observations, even though nobody has the same sensory observation because everyone interprets information differently, you can somehow just derive objective things from data sets and sensory observations.
Yeah, it's absolutely terrible. Like, why would you attempt to come to this conclusion? I mean, this is the kind of problem where when you're looking at pure data without any context whatsoever and without any understanding, you're going to come to a whole bunch of very wild conclusions. I'm sure you get 20 different people to look at the same exact data that Dick Furry puts forward, and they're going to come to 20 different conclusions. They might even come to 21 different conclusions. But this kind of thing is just absolutely divorced from any kind of causal explanation. In addition to, well, you haven't properly defined your terms, which is going to be the problem with trying to explain anything on the basis of the anti-concepts that you are so heavily invested in.
Yeah, I mean, I know that I'm being pretty hard on Richard Wolff, but to be completely fair, I have absolutely no respect for him, and I wholeheartedly believe, not only believe it, but I have reasons to prove it, that I could demonstrate that even Richard Wolff doesn't believe what he's trying to sell people, and I'd be willing to tell him that to his face as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd very much like to see that, someone call him out on his abject nonsense. But anyways, let's continue.
Childish, and I'm not going to dignify it by a response. Whatever it is you think Russia and China are, economic growth they have excelled at. For the last 30 years, their economic growth has been faster every single year than that of the United States, despite every effort being made to deny or undercut that reality. Now to the logic of the question. This logic hangs on the following equation, which doesn't work. That scarcity, the actuality of scarcity, is measured by something's price.
No. That's not what price is. I don't think there's any. Has there ever historically been any example or any economic theory that stated that scarcity is measured by price?
No.
I
mean, not even the classical theorists argued this. This is the Malthusian trap, which was refuted extensively even by David Ricardo. So, I mean, and this is something only Marxists believe, by the way, and that's the reason why Marxism, this is, aside from the other problems with how Marxists approach the study of markets, this is another reason why I don't consider it an economic theory. It's not an attempt to observe what resources are, how they come into being, how people use them. It just states these things are objectively resources. They're intrinsically resources that can be used in these ways. And we need to find out what sort of political system or lack thereof would be able to distribute these things in ways that we like. That's not a study of markets. That's just being an authoritarian.
Mm-hmm. Albedo asks what my thoughts are on the Great Reset. I already said them earlier in the stream. You probably missed that. I believe it was around the 40-minute mark. So if you want to know what my thoughts are, go back to that, because honestly, I really don't feel like repeating myself on that.
But as for what Richard Wolff is saying here, his argument again implies that there is sort of an intrinsic value that resources are traded around, and that there's an objective material sense in which these resources are just present, and all markets are a zero-sum system, because of course things like innovation, which changes how we use resources, and things becoming less capital intense, and speciality having a smaller divide between people who are specialized in a field and people who aren't. I should say skill levels being lowered significantly to produce in a certain market. Yeah, none of that has anything to do with the availability of resources or what resource production entails, nor does it have anything to do with wealth. Wealth is just a static thing that exists. A resource is just a static thing that exists. Like, good God, dude.
This is quite special. And I'm just thinking about this. If you took the claim that Austrians believe that price is a value of scarcity seriously, then that leads to a whole bunch of very unpleasant implications. Namely that how much of a correlation is there between a price and between a price and scarcity? So would the ability for something to be produced affect its price in any way, according to the Austrian theory? Is it possible, like, if there's two mud pies in the world, would they have exactly the same value as the two hover Lamborghinis that exist on Earth? Would those have the same value? Or what about Ferrari Enzos, one of the rarest cars in the world? Just to continue on the automobile example, I think there's like 150 of those left, and they're, as I'm sure you're aware, extremely valuable. Would they have the same price as 150? If there were only 150 again mud pies, for example?
This would imply that things would have economic value if there were no people, or if there was only one person on Earth, i.e., in circumstances where there wasn't a society.
In other words, price exists in a vacuum, largely external, or value exists in a vacuum, external, and you kind of end up at the same problem where you would need to empirically determine that value is something that's inherent to any given object that exists on Earth. To say nothing of the fact that, well, any object is just going to be an amalgamation of its parts, so each of their individual parts are going to have their own value, and usually those parts are going to be amalgamations of something else until we get down to the atomic level. Do atoms have value? Is something's value inherently determined by how many atoms make it up?
You don't understand Marx's theory.
Apparently I don't, and neither do Marxists. So, I mean, I'm just trying to figure this stuff out because I'm just trying to take their ideas to a logical conclusion. Because this crap does not make any sense whatsoever.
And no, you can't get around this problem, in case any Marxists are watching this video, by adding caveats to what counts as labor, just making them up on the spot like Marx did. Things like use value or socially necessary value. Because not only does that turn your argument into a presupposition, a tautology, where anything that's observed that affects value is something that is a condition of labor. Also, that negates the idea that labor is an intrinsic. It has an intrinsic value, which is sort of the entire point of the labor theory of value, that things just have these sort of static, unchanging values, and it's affected by how much labor is put into it. If it changed based on social variables, that itself would sort of negate the entire premise. But somehow, within the Marxist framework, would also confirm it at the same time. Yeah, TLDR, Marxists don't understand the difference between price and value, and that's the reason why they're so confused on this point. They see administered prices in the market, things which aren't even born out of market incentives, or they just look at people setting prices for these things, and they observe that those people won't sell for less, or they won't change their prices arbitrarily, and they'll take that as, see, there's an intrinsic value there. It's small-brained beyond belief, especially for somebody who has a PhD in studying economic theory, i.e., that means at the very least they've been studying for 12 years.
Well, he got his PhD in 1969, around the time when the boomers were coming of age and the Frankfurt School was at its prime in terms of indoctrinating kids. So there's a very good chance that his PhD in economics could basically be revised as PhD in Marxist economics, and nothing would change whatsoever. But this kind of reminds me of what you said. Kind of reminds me of that meme you sent me a couple days ago. The one I'm trying to. Sorry?
The one where it's Man Ray and Patrick is Marx and Hayek is Man Ray, even though it should be Bomb of Work based on the point of the meme.
Yes, that one. Perfect. And for those of you, should I pull it up on the stream so people know what I'm talking about?
Go ahead. This is pretty great.
I pulled it up so they can only see a part of it because of just how the screen is cropped. I'll have it on screen shortly.
But yeah, if you've ever argued with a Marxist about value, this is probably how it went. This is basically how Marxists responded to Bomb of Work as well. So,
And
by Marxists, I mean the academics claiming to be Marxists who try to defend his theories on economics.
Yep, here it is. It's it's pretty accurate to exactly what you would imagine I've had conversations like this, not in these exact words, of course, but pointing this out pretty quickly. Once you understand the idea of socially necessary things in Marxism, you start to understand that they're trying very hard to reconcile supply and demand and subjective theory of value without actually getting into subjective theory of value. And as a result, they have to become very, very slippery about it.
Yeah, David Ricardo himself, which a lot of Marxists seemingly to try and grant their theory legitimacy by claiming, oh look, Marx's theory of value is based on the classical theory of value, as though that's supposed to be like, oh well, Austrians, well, we're critics of Marx, but Marx is based on because they don't understand that there's a difference between the Austrians, the monetarists, the classicals. They just kind of group us into one category, and they also assume that we're approaching the conversation from a political perspective like they are. They think that just citing a quote unquote capitalist figure to us is gonna mean anything. But they try and claim that Marx's theory of value is based on Adam Smith's or David Ricardo's, when no, first of all, the labor theory of value predates Smith and Ricardo. But also the classical models operated around cost theory. And not only that, but David Ricardo himself actually pointed out in one of his essays why you couldn't create, you couldn't just redefine labor in order to get around the problems with, you couldn't just redefine labor or whatever cost input we're talking about in order to get around the problems with cost theory of value. Both Smith and Ricardo noted that there was a problem with cost theory of value as well, which Marx did not. Basically, I think that Marx, he came up with his theory of history first, and then retroactively to try and justify his theory of history, he picked up some economist lingo from various sources and patched together some D&D lore for how his interpretation of history was right, but didn't really understand economic theory. So
I think it's more along the lines of he picked up Hegel, didn't understand a single word of it because nobody freaking understands Hegel, and then used his own and basically created some fan fiction, some Hegel fan fiction, and then published that. That's a Communist Manifesto.
I was referring to Capital, but sure. But I guess we could continue, see what Wolff has to say.
All right.
Furry, whatever.
Dick Furry.
This is cuckoo. This makes no sense. But
Right,
let me give you an
doesn't make
example.
sense.
'Cause
Technical
this, really,
economic
this
term.
is not a subtle argument. This is not a subtle argument, right? I'll give you a couple of examples. A safe way to produce massive amounts of electricity is in fact very scarce, because all of the ways we know how to do that are dangerous. They're either fossil fuels that are polluting our air, or they're nuclear energy, which we don't quite know how to control or keep safe.
Don't freak out.
Bruh.
I don't think you guys heard my sigh.
No, it actually, Market has been trying to introduce different types of engines. By the market, I mean various entrepreneurs speculating with their resources for decades now. And nuclear energy is not only do we understand it well enough that it could easily be an energy alternative, but we're actually at the point where it's almost kind of outdated in many regards. But the reason why we're stuck with fossil fuels is because of the patent office, basically. Because every entrepreneur who obtains their funds through these white market loaning institutions or academia, who discover all these ways to create engines. I mean, there was one that was just published the last year, I think. It ran on like CO2, I think. It was an engine that ran on CO2. I'd have to go find that, but we talked about it with 2 cents on his stream. But yeah, every time somebody discovers a way to do this, it just gets shelved by one of the universities that they're working for, or it gets suppressed by the patent office. Because the fossil fuel market is one of the most cartelized markets in the political economy for pretty much every nation on Earth. And the reason for that is because it's very easy to manipulate. It's very easy to manipulate incentives in the fossil fuel market by issuing decrees or by starting wars, for instance, with other nations. So it's something that the state can manipulate fairly easily and manufacture loans in their political market just by acting.
Mm-hmm.
So if such a type of fuel that wasn't very cost intensive were to dominate in society, it would mean that states would benefit less from manufacturing demand for loans by starting wars, for instance, or by doing any of the other things that they do in order to try and manipulate people into spending.
Mm-hmm. Don't really have much more to add to that, other than that Dick Furry wants to make general statements, because if he were forced to get into the reasons why things are the way they are, why the white market in energy is set up the way it is, and why there aren't a whole bunch of entrepreneurial ideas, or why there aren't a whole bunch of entrepreneurial explorations into alternative forms of energy, including making use of resources that are not that scarce at all, for example, CO2 and even water, then he would recognize very quickly that his own ideas don't work. So, yeah, anyways, let's continue. See what else this idiot, small brain moron has to say.
For the people.
Yes,
That's
I mean,
another group of people that needs to calm down.
There
Okay,
may
keep
be
going.
ways
Yes.
to change that,
There
but
may
for the
be
moment,
ways, see that?
there may be ways to change that. I'm
Yeah,
not
deep breaths.
forever gloom and doom, but in fact,
Deep breaths.
good energy is scarce. But we don't have people figuring out what the price of energy is, taking into account its real scarcity.
Right.
We instead measure how much we have to pay for it. And if you subsidize energy, as the world does, and if you make it, you don't care what the pollution is, and you don't care what the real costs all over the place are of getting these things, well, then you have a low price, and then everybody uses it. But that's not a sign of efficiency. And
Fuel has an intrinsic value. The reason people don't invest in trying to find new types of fuel is because it's not profitable. Duh. Oh my god.
What the hell? I'm having trouble understanding Dick Furry's argument here.
I almost can't even take that argument seriously. So he's suggesting that investment is disincentivized in markets. I almost don't even. How do you respond to that other than mockery?
I'm trying to wrap my head around what he was trying to say, and what I think he was saying is that the reason that fossil fuels and current forms of energy are as cheap as they are is because they receive government subsidies. So if you put government subsidies into other forms of energy, they'll suddenly become the same price, and people will start using them.
What?
I could be wrong in my interpretation, but what he just said did not. I don't think he made a coherent argument or made a coherent statement.
What he's arguing is like the premise of what he's claiming is based around the assumption that prices are influenced by some sort of intrinsic, static, unchanging metric. So trying to understand what he's arguing it's a futile endeavor because it's based around something. It's like macroeconomic models on steroids, by which I mean macroeconomic models are created basically post hoc by anyone with mostly Keynesians, but MMT theorists do this as well, as a way to get around people pointing out instances where like certain principles they've claimed about the market are being contradicted by how people are actually acting. They try and aggregate demand in a bunch of different markets in order to basically bullshit their way to a different result. Well, Marxists can do this with just what it boils down to for something to even be a commodity. What counts as a commodity and what counts as market activity. This intrinsic value standard gives them full control over that because they don't have, within their own framework that they're arguing from, they don't have to justify what counts as a market action or labor or a commodity. So they essentially could just argue whatever the fuck they want, and unless you're going to challenge Marxist theory, there's no way to contradict them from within their own reasoning, because they're not actually claiming anything. They're just kind of making shit up and throwing it at the wall and seeing if something sticks. Classic Platonism, in other words.
Pretty much. Let's see what other incoherent ramblings he's going to put forward.
Me, in the age of some ecological and environmental awareness, where we know that if
he's not actually saying anything here, and I'll probably back up a little bit, but who are those guys in the lower left corner?
I think maybe Michael Brooks' editors. Honestly, I don't know. They haven't said a single word, and that guy in the background is just kind of sitting there on the couch. So if this is group of editors for his podcast, well, then he should get rid of that guy because he's not really doing anything. But yeah, I beats me. My guess is as good as yours.
All right.
Some ecological and environmental awareness where we know that if we teach in economics, it's efficient for a company to go into some factory business if they measure the costs of the fuel and the inputs and the labor, and they measure the price of the outputs, and the revenue is larger than the cost. Oh, goody, that's a profit. The prices work that way. It's efficient.
The prices work that way. The prices work that way. Oh my god. It's like listening to the comic relief character in a cartoon try and summarize the plot to somebody, to a new character who's like entering in and doesn't know what's going on. That's what listening to Richard Wolff talking about market incentives is like.
I love the assumption that you can just measure revenue. This is, to a certain extent, you can do forecasts. However, fundamentally, revenue is not something you can predict because, well, yeah, it depends entirely on consumer demand, which is going to be very difficult to pin down. To say nothing of the fact that it consistently oscillates from time to time, often seemingly at random, in addition to several factors that are completely outside your control. People don't want coffee nearly as much when it's frickin' hot outside, for example, and you have no control over the weather. With this in mind, it reminds me of a response I made to non-compete. Think in 2018, where he did try to explain. One of the arguments that he made, like, operated under the assumption that revenue was just this static thing that companies could just get as a result of production, and made no actual understanding of where revenue comes from or how it is, and it's completely divorced from consumer interests, consumer preferences, and just consumers in general. It's just a thing that happens to companies. They just have revenue.
Yeah, I could try to dissect the reasoning of that, but I don't even know how many levels of brain we're on, so I'm afraid that doing so would like actually hurt me.
Probably. I mean, we're at the point where compressing your thoughts to such a minuscule level is actually going to cost IQ points. It depends on it depends on how much you value driving down that toll road.
Yeah, I mean, I will never just like outright say Marxism is wrong, you're wrong, stop being wrong. But that's essentially how you have to don't argue that way, but that's essentially in order to keep your brain intact, that's how you have to approach these people, honestly. It's kind of sad, but you can a lot of people are drawn to Marxism because of the absolute sort of ass understanding of economic theory that government schools instill into people, and there's a reason it's so popular in Saharan Africa, because another reason people are drawn to Marxism is because Marxism, not only is it does it instill sense of allegiance because it's tied to a state, it's tied to political incentives. So it sort of ties Marxist theory to, from the statists' perspective, their own perception of what their interests are. It also, like, the entire premise of Marxist theory is we'll do these things and that'll achieve this world where bad things don't exist. There's a reason it's so popular in places like India and many parts of Saharan Africa, basically anywhere where there's not actually a state operating around a Marxist model economy, because it's like televangelism. This shit attracts desperate people like flies to honey.
Mm-hmm. Anyways, continuing.
If the smokestack of this factory emits terrible particles that cause the paint to chip and the tires to crack and people to get sick, then the cost, the efficiency for the economy has to count all of the costs that flow from this product. But we don't do that in capitalism. We only require the capitalist to count the costs he's responsible for paying. We don't require him to count the costs he is relieved of payment for.
That's not a market incentive. That's a product of corporate law. That's literally something that the state does, and something that the state will do under planned economies. The USSR, China, any example of a state that state socialists or Marxists will point to as sort of a model for what they're talking about. They specifically create like legal standards and licensing standards for their for the producers in their political markets as a way to let them get away with doing more things to people than they would otherwise be able to get away with. And polluting other people's property is a great example of that. That's something that would you can't pollute someone else's property without the state there protecting you from them defending themselves, because that's an act of aggression. You're destroying someone else's resources. You're destroying their land. You're destroying their property. So,
I mean, we can already hear from the language he's using that Dick Furry is arguing in favor of a policy prescription. That the problem is that people are not required to count the costs associated with the byproducts of their production, and therefore we don't have. Sorry.
But of course, he's talking about capitalism, which to Marxists is basically simultaneously market incentives, but also state incentives which don't market themselves as Marxist. Being issued by states which don't market themselves as Marxist states, then they're capitalist states. Doesn't matter if they're functionally identical, they're not Marxist states, therefore they're capitalist states.
Anyways, let's continue.
Consequently, when he does something responding to the price system, it is exactly groping in the dark, because the efficiency of it is unknown and may be very seriously negative. That is, the costs of the damaged health and the damaged environment may well exceed the profit margin of the product. So that if we actually...
Motherfucker, are you serious?
So is he's contradicting, or he's trying to, he's not doing a very good job, mind you, but he's clearly trying to appeal to the calculation problem to state how companies and firms are not economical.
Yeah.
In a video where he tries to debunk the calculation problem.
Yeah, and as we pointed out, that's not a contradiction of the calculation argument. In fact, many Austrians have pointed out that firms operating within the state's white market suffer from a variant of the calculation problem, or several variants, depending on what market we're talking about.
But capitalists get wrecked epic style.
XDDD.
Exclamation point, exclamation point, 1111, exclamation point.
It's really ironic that that's essentially like the Marxist stereotype for people who attempt to argue against Marxism. Because that's basically how they argue against us. Or, well, people who they disagree with. I shouldn't say us, but yeah, it's especially egregious when they're approaching Austro-libertarians, because Austro-libertarians are, if you look at the content creators who have that perspective, they're basically out of, I would say, any sort of community. Generally, they're the ones that are approaching from like the more scientific, introspective positions. In fact, their position stems from a deconstruction of politics, so they don't try to group everyone they don't like into one category of people. Of course, that's not strictly true. You have the Hoppians, who honestly are not Austrians or libertarians, trying to associate with the Austro-libertarians, who operate very much like that. And then you have the political libertarian types, but they're increasingly becoming a minority. If not already a minority, because most of the Austro-libertarians I run into, if they're not agorists, then they're definitely skeptical of political economies, or the idea that politics and society are sort of intrinsically linked together.
Yeah, I don't really have anything much more to add to that. Continuing.
cared about real scarcity and real efficiency, we wouldn't produce that product because the costs exceed the revenue. But because capitalists, when they look at prices, only count those they have to pay, we get the result that isn't efficient, and we know it's not efficient, so that this is the purest form of ideological obfuscation. It reverses.
That's literally not. That's literally not how calculation works. I've never run a firm, but I know that people who run firms have to take into consideration, have to basically speculate on what demand will be in consumer trends.
What, they don't just know that revenue is going to be a static function of just production?
This is not even economic theory. That's just factually not how calculation inside of firms takes place. Like there's an increasing amount of evidence just from this video that Heretic and I's assumption about Wolff that he has never left the institution he works for in at least a decade is probably true. All those talks he gave at Google, he didn't actually go outside. They just got like a van and pressed it up against the door of the university, and he like crawled into the back of it like a fucking prison bus.
Don't really have anything more to add. Just continuing. Sorry, I'm a little distracted at the moment.
All right.
Question substitutes a question of prices and then makes a flim-flam as if doing things around the price system ipso facto makes you efficient. It never did, and it doesn't now.
And what about the European voice point?
European voice point is very good.
Thank you.
The only problem with it is that I periodically resort to French and German, which were my first languages, and I inflect my English a little just to get a little more
fine.
levitation.
Work that hustle. But it doesn't work on me, frankly. I don't have no respect for Europeans here. None. You guys, that was great. Professor Burgess,
So that's it?
Guess so. I mean,
Jesus fucking Christ, that was bad.
I mean, this is your brain on pure Marxism. It causes you to get a
like these state socialist theorists who keep thinking that they've found a rebuttal to the calculation argument without even understanding the Austrian methodology. I mean, it would be adorable, honestly, if it wasn't for the fact that what they're suggesting and the ideas that they're spreading are so horribly destructive.
I
What were you
mean,
gonna say?
not really all that much. It's just that this is just making a pure observation in that this is your brain on Marxism. It gives you a bathrobe Dwayne hairline.
Oh man, but yeah, not even like we're not even at the point where you're just not taking into consideration these sort of conceptual entailment claims or about like what counts as a principle in economics. We're just like denying that you even need to justify your economic theories from the Marxist perspective here. They're just sort of like, well, this is the way it is. Why is that the way it is? Because fuck you, that's why. Marx said so. It doesn't matter if it's not even internally consistent. Doesn't matter if there are convincing arguments put out in other schools of thought which explain what we're attempting to better and actually do have an explanation for what they're observing. Doesn't matter if what we're arguing against isn't actually something anyone else ever argued. just I don't even know how to characterize this. It's yeah, I think that it's depressing that there are a lot of people. I wouldn't say that it's like a mainstream problem, because YouTube's algorithms and the algorithms of like Google tend to blow up people like this quite a bit, and Twitter. What people have to realize about Twitter is basically when Tumblr banned porn blogs, all the people on Tumblr just flocked over to Twitter. So it's not that an increasing number of people are taking these ideas seriously. It's that an increasing number of people who were already promoting these ideas are flocking over, away from what would have been basically just their corner of the internet, and into the areas where the not stupid people are associating with one another and trying to talk about their ideas. So I say that loosely because you can't really explain yourself that well on Twitter, which I'd imagine is a big part of the reason why Marxism is able to survive on that platform. 140 tweets essentially only leaves you the ability to make claims but not have to justify them.
I think a while back they increased their character count to 280, but you still have the exact same problem where there's just not enough ability to add nuance to a discussion, and so it's basically just a bunch of people stating their conclusions at one another and hoping that the other person will just agree with it right away. The best nuance you're gonna get are Twitter threads, where it's just like a string of tweets all put together. But Twitter threads are also very obnoxious to go through. And at that point, you might as well just go onto a message board somewhere where people can actually have actual discussions or something that resembles discussions. But yeah, there's not really much more to say except I kind of seriously question what would the appropriate term be? I really question the motivations of people who still put forward Marxism, because not only has Marxism like easily one of the most thoroughly debunked ideas in existence, but it's also so bad and so contradictory that I have to wonder that if people have a kind of underlying explanation for why it is that they're so invested in Marxism and why they are so fervent in defending it and completely ignoring the overwhelming amounts of intellectual evidence that completely contradicts and debunks Marxism. I know
Well, I
you're.
think we already touched upon that. It's because it's a philosophy which strategically tries to incorporate as many aspects of nature into a political perspective as possible. So Marxism's not, we were talking about the self-proclaimed libertarians who would cite Marxism as a type of libertarianism. Not only is it like pro-political, it's hyper-political. So because all these aspects of society become incorporated into the somebody who would consider themselves a statist or would defend the state, who we would consider statist, because they conflate that with their own interests and their own sense of identity. When they find Marxism, it basically drives them crazy because they can't look at anything without thinking that basically somebody is fucking them over, and that's the reason why what they're looking at isn't more to their liking, or somebody is depriving them of something, and that's the reason why every undesirable trait of the world that they identify is the way it is. Because that's how politics works. It's never actually being self-reliant, going out and producing things for yourself and owning your own labor, as they like to put it, is heavily disincentivized because, of course, only the state can give you these things, and or the state can create the way for you to do these things. So everything becomes a question of just, I need the state to do this in order to have my interests met. And since Marxists see every aspect of their life from that perspective, from this perspective, it's no surprise that they behave like a bunch of fucking lunatics.
Yeah, I suppose that makes sense. I mean, I'm just constructing the idea in my head right now. And if you do see literally every aspect of your life as being the result of a policy prescription that is either working against you or in favor of you, then it makes sense that you physically cannot exist without the state prescribing your existence. And so, with this in mind, your political opponents are an existential threat to, as I said earlier, your existence.
So that's the reason I would argue that not only do statists behave in a tribal way, and they sort of actively avoid sort of introspective questions about the social sciences methodology, what justifies those methodologies, or what characterizes them. They avoid those questions because another insidious thing that politics does is that it tries, well, through the method of political science, it tries to fuse politics and society. So observations in society are necessarily tied to policies decreed by the state or actions taken by the state. So the reason that people, and you have these incentives with parties where you can't have multiple parties representing these policies, because from the perspective of party politics, parties have to be a monopoly. There can't be competition between them. Yeah, it's they don't, that actively discourages criticism of one's own principles that they associate with these sorts of policies. And that's the reason why even within the libertarian circles, the political types treat us the way that they do. It's because challenging or simply just trying to introduce a more nuanced understanding of things like property or the Austrian methodology, it challenges that sort of monopoly whatever political allegiance they're defending has. So it's disincentivized, even though it doesn't, even though this type of criticism only strengthens methodologies and sciences if that is, if they're legitimate attempts to explain the natural world, then making their explanation of why things are the way they are more robust can't do anything other than help them.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I don't really have anything much more to add to that. I mean, honestly, like I think I made a video like early 2019 about how Marxism has become boring. It's like once you've heard one Marxist, you've heard them all.
Well, it's the reason I don't talk about Marxism very much, and I would definitely agree with that. Marxists have become, because whether or not they want to admit it, they've noticed that the algorithm's been benefiting their content more recently. So they've sort of, more Marxists have become Dunning-Krugers, because from their perspective, they think that their ideas are sort of winning the debate. But yeah, they're not making new arguments. In fact, the newer Marxists who are coming along are definitely succumbing to the effects of philosophical inbreeding. Like, the only ones that I'm even remotely interested in talking about at this point are people like Vicky 1999. And the only reason why is just because their content is so mind-bogglingly fucking dumb that I can't believe it exists. It's not even so much about refuting Marxism. Honestly, I'm more concerned at this point about people like Tucker Carlson and these statists trying to co-opt libertarian talking points. I think that's a bigger threat to the libertarian movement than Marxism is. Case in point, Marxism was originally sort of like a Hoppian position in the 19th century libertarian debate. That's the reason why their talking points are basically just a bastardized version of libertarian criticisms of the state back in the day. Except they attempt to employ, the state socialist types attempt to employ political means as a way to correct these problems, which are sort of necessarily inconsistent and run contradictory with the ends that they're talking about. So if you don't think subversion is a threat, Marxism's existence would kind of negate that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sorry if I'm a little if I'm not saying anything right now. I'm just doing something else right now.
And,
so,
I look at these groups like the Hoppians or the Propertarians who what they're targeting is specifically libertarians, like the foundation of the libertarians' criticism of the state, like their principles upon which they criticize the state. These groups are trying to co-opt that and bring it and make it so the newer libertarians don't really understand the nuances between politics and society, property theory, concepts like self-ownership, what that entails. So I do consider that to be a threat, because if they succeed, the actual movement of people who are libertarians would become philosophically would become basically non-existent. But you may have an increase of people who call themselves libertarians, and they even cite the principles which characterize the libertarian criticism of the state. Their understanding of these principles, though, are bastardized beyond belief, to the point where they basically are just arguing for, in the Hoppians' case, feudalism.
yeah, I can see why they'd be a bigger threat. I remember what you were saying earlier about Hoppians and the Tucker Carlson crowd being a bigger threat, particularly because, well, you said it earlier, that they do everything they can to purposefully undermine the foundations by which libertarians can refute the state conceptually, and then replace it with their own quasi-Marxist understanding that is fundamentally structuralist, that fundamentally makes the assumption that any kind of social organization is something that needs to be prescribed onto people from the top down, and as such, when you take that view, it becomes a lot more reasonable when you watch a Tucker Carlson video, or when you watch a Tucker Carlson clip, let alone watch a show, and you see him talking about American patriotism and protect the blue line and any other kind of rhetorical nonsense that he's going on about now. The Democrats stole our election. That's been the big thing recently. Don't know if he's still talking about that, but yeah, once you have that happen, you kind of end up. Once you have that, you kind of end up in a situation where, what's his name? Paul Joseph Stalin, where he was previously an anarchist, but I don't know if he went full Hoppian or not. But yeah, he's very much a statist conservatard now.
He followed Stefan Molyneux's road of where he got sort of sucked into the culture war debate, and he followed the alt-right path. But anyway, I think that's enough for the stream, or we've sort of talked about everything that we wanted to. You go ahead and put like an invite link in the chat, so people who aren't in the Discord may be able to join if they want to.
Yeah, sure. All right. Well, everybody, thank you for stopping by, and we'll see you next time. Do you have anything to say?
We'll be in the Discord after this, so anybody who wants to talk to us certainly can. Anyway, we'll start doing that at the end of every show, because we talk about things that are happening in the Discord. So yeah, we'll see you guys next time and see the